It was the summer of 2012, a year I'll never forget. I was 24 at the time, living in a small town in Oregon, far away from the busy city life I had grown tired of. I needed an escape, something to clear my mind after a tough few months of work and stress. So when a buddy of mine, Ryan, suggested a weekend camping trip, I jumped at the idea. It was just supposed to be a quick getaway, a chance to get out into the woods and disconnect from everything. I never could have imagined how the trip would change me. We decided to head to a place called Clear Creek, a remote camping spot deep in the Oregon Cascades. The place was known for its tranquility, a few scattered cabins along the creek, and lots of thick forest. No cell service, no distractions, just us and nature. That's what I thought, at least. We packed up our gear, set out from town around 4 p.m., and arrived at the campsite just as the sun was dipping below the horizon. The drive had been peaceful, winding through old pines and past fast-moving rivers. I remember the air feeling cool, even though it was late spring, and the scent of pine and damp earth filling the car. We didn't see many other vehicles on the road, just the occasional truck, and that added to the sense of isolation. By the time we arrived, the camp was quiet, too quiet almost. It wasn't exactly the type of place where people camped in large groups. There was no campsite manager or rangers patrolling the area. It was just an open forest with a few cleared areas and fire rings. Ryan and I found a spot near the creek, far from the few cabins that dotted the land. The site was small, but it had a perfect view of the water. We set up our tent and fire pit, grabbed some firewood, and got the flames going. As night fell, the forest around us seemed to come alive. The distant calls of animals, the rustling of leaves in the trees, and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot filled the air. It was peaceful, but there was something about the isolation that felt off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up every now and then. We spent the first few hours talking, roasting marshmallows, and drinking some beers. I tried to push away the odd feeling I had, but it kept creeping up. After a while, the conversation lulled, and we both sat there in silence, staring into the fire. The flames flickered, and I watched as they cast long shadows on the trees surrounding us. The fire felt like a barrier between us and whatever was out there in the dark. It was around midnight when the noises started. At first, I thought it was just the wind or an animal moving through the woods, but as the sounds grew more distinct, I started to feel uneasy. There was something out there. I could hear the faint sound of footsteps in the underbrush, followed by something that sounded like branches snapping. Ryan noticed it too. He looked at me, his face pale in the firelight. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice low. I nodded, my eyes scanning the darkness. "Yeah, sounds like someone's walking out there." We both stood up, our eyes locked on the thick woods beyond the firelight. The footsteps stopped for a moment, and all I could hear was the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustling in the trees. I don't know why, but I felt like someone or something was watching us. I kept expecting to see a figure emerge from the shadows, but nothing did. The silence grew heavy, and we stood there for what felt like an eternity, waiting. Then, without warning, a large crash came from the forest, followed by the unmistakable sound of something heavy moving through the brush. Ryan and I both jumped back, hearts racing. The noise came from just beyond the tree line, too close for comfort. My first instinct was to grab the flashlight, but I didn't want to give away our position if it was someone trying to sneak up on us. We just stood there, frozen. I could hear my heart pounding in my chest. After what felt like an age, the sound of movement finally stopped. I don't know how long it lasted, but when it was over, the forest went silent again. The kind of silence that felt unnatural. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, waiting for us to make the wrong move. Ryan and I exchanged a look, and without saying a word, we both agreed that it was time to go inside the tent. We quickly doused the fire, grabbed our things, and zipped up the tent, leaving the outside world behind. Inside, the temperature dropped, and the shadows cast by our headlamps danced on the walls of the tent. We tried to ignore the gnawing feeling of unease that had settled in our stomachs. There was no talking about what had happened. We just lay there, staring into the darkness, listening for any more sounds from outside. As the hours ticked by, I could hear Ryan's breathing slow down, his deep sleep settling in. But I couldn't sleep. My mind kept racing, replaying every little sound I had heard. I kept picturing someone, moving outside the tent, waiting for the right moment. It felt like we were being hunted, like we weren't alone. Eventually, around 3 a.m., the sounds returned. I heard them faintly at first. More twigs snapping, more rustling, but this time it was closer, much closer. It was as if whatever it was circling us, moving through the underbrush just beyond our tent. The sound of something heavy scraping against the ground sent a shiver down my spine. My breath hitched in my throat as I strained my ears, trying to figure out what was out there. Then, there was a new sound, something that froze my blood in my veins. A whisper, a soft voice. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but then it came again, clearer this time. It was low, unintelligible, but it was unmistakable. A voice coming from the direction of the trees. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as my mind raced. Who would be out there at this time of night? Why weren't they speaking clearly? Was someone trying to mess with us? I kept telling myself it had to be a prank, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. There was something about the way the voice came through, the way the sound echoed off the trees. It didn't feel right. I shook Ryan awake, my voice hoarse from fear. He stirred but didn't fully wake up. I grabbed his arm, shaking him harder. "Ryan, wake up. Something's out there." He groggily opened his eyes, his face still half turned towards the darkness outside the tent. "What? You're freaking me out." "No, listen," I whispered, my voice shaking. "There's someone out there." We both lay still, the tent trembling slightly in the wind, straining to hear. The whispering grew louder, closer. It was like someone was right outside the tent now, speaking in a language we couldn't understand. Ryan finally sat up, wide awake now. "Okay, this isn't funny. We need to get out of here." I felt my pulse quicken. "Do you have a weapon? A knife? Anything?" Ryan didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed his backpack and pulled out a small pocket knife, his hands trembling. I did the same, my fingers fumbling as I unsheathed my own knife. We sat there, listening to the voice grow louder and more frantic. The whispers had turned into incoherent murmurs, but it was clear something was wrong. We couldn't stay here any longer. We carefully unzipped the tent, trying not to make a sound. The cold night air hit me like a slap in the face. The forest outside was unnervingly quiet. There was no movement, no sound except for the distant hum of the wind. I peered into the darkness, but all I saw was the blackness of the trees, their silhouettes twisted by the faint light of the moon. "Let's go. Now," Ryan hissed. We didn't need any more encouragement. We grabbed our bags and ran. We didn't know where we were going or how far we had to go to get away from whatever was out there, but we couldn't stay any longer. The forest felt like it was closing in around us, the trees like dark figures watching us. It wasn't until we reached the edge of the creek that we stopped, gasping for breath, our legs aching from the sprint. The only sound was the rushing water. We stood there for a few moments, not saying a word, just trying to catch our breath. After a while, we looked at each other, our faces pale with fear. We weren't alone out there, but whatever it was, whatever had been following us, whispering in the dark, it was gone. For now, we didn't go back to that campsite. In fact, we didn't go back to Clear Creek at all. The next day, we packed up and left as quickly as we could, the events of that night haunting us both. We couldn't explain what happened. There were no signs of anyone out there. No footprints, no broken branches, just the feeling of being hunted, of being watched. We never spoke about it again. Years later, I found myself back in Oregon, this time with my wife and kids. We were on a road trip through the Cascades when we passed by Clear Creek. I had to stop and take a look. I don't know why. Maybe I thought I could find some kind of closure. But when I got there, the place was different. The trees were taller, the creek quieter, but there was an odd stillness in the air. And when I looked down the path leading to the camping site, I saw something that made my heart stop. a figure standing at the edge of the forest. I was 32 the summer I decided to hike and camp alone in the Blue Ridge Mountains. It was 2019. I had just quit my job at a mid-level marketing firm in Raleigh, North Carolina, and I needed time away from people, buildings, and blinking screens. I had some savings, no kids, no spouse, and nothing urgent tying me down. So I packed up my gear, loaded it into the back of my black Subaru Outback, and started driving west toward the hills. I'd done solo camping before, though never for more than a couple of days. This time, I wanted at least a week.
No designated campgrounds, no pub trails.
I wanted isolation, real wilderness. I had studied maps and satellite imagery for weeks before going, planning out a route that cut through a less trafficked part of the range, an area where the trails were old logging paths, some barely visible anymore, and the only thing you might see over a few days would be deer and birds, maybe the occasional black bear. I told my sister where I'd be generally, gave her the rough coordinates, the route I intended to hike, and told her I'd check in when I got back to civilization. I didn't bring a GPS tracker. I know how that sounds now, but at the time I thought it was fine. I had compass and map skills, plenty of food, water filtration gear, a good tent, and enough survival tools to build a second camp if I needed to. I reached the trailhead by late afternoon on a Tuesday. There was no one around, just the crunch of gravel under my tires and the hiss of wind through the tall pines. I parked under a cluster of trees, shouldered my 70-liter pack, locked the car, and started walking east along the old, faded trail that curved through the tree line. The first 2 days were quiet, peaceful even. I hiked about 8 miles the first day, stopping by a stream to set up camp just before sunset, made a small fire, cooked a pouch of chili mac, and listened to the forest settle for the night. There were owls, raccoons somewhere nearby, and once I heard a heavy body crashing through the brush, probably a deer. I slept light, but I always do in a tent. The second day, I followed a narrow ridgeline trail and then dropped into a small valley filled with wildflowers and moss-covered boulders. I found a flat spot next to a trickling creek and set up there. I saw bear scat nearby, old, dry, but no prints, no fresh signs. I strung up my food in a bear bag about 50 yards from my tent and made sure I followed every safety guideline I'd read and practiced. That night was a little different. I woke up at some point, not sure what time, and thought I heard something, or maybe someone, moving through the trees across the creek. It wasn't loud, but it wasn't an animal either. Not the rhythmic snap of a deer or the low pad of a bear. This was slower, hesitant, almost like someone walking barefoot, carefully, over forest floor. I sat up, heart thudding. Didn't unzip the tent, just listened. It went on for maybe 2 minutes. Then nothing, just the soft rush of the creek and the wind. Eventually, I drifted off again. By the third day, I started feeling uneasy. I pushed farther east, climbing a narrow draw and moving through dense undergrowth until I reached a rocky plateau around midday. It gave me a partial view of the surrounding ridges. I thought I saw movement down below, a flicker of something white, but when I focused, there was nothing, just the wind bending the tall grass. I ate lunch on the rocks, took off my boots to let my feet breathe, then packed up and kept going. I figured it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I'd been alone for nearly 3 full days by then, and solitude can do weird things to your perception. I camped in a dense patch of woods that night, down in a hollow that seemed protected from the wind. I didn't sleep well. Around midnight, I woke up again. No sound at first, but that feeling was back. That sense that someone was nearby. You know when every hair on your arms stands up for no reason? Like your body knows something you don't? I stayed still, breathing slow, trying not to make a sound. Then I heard it again. Footsteps. Soft, deliberate. Leaves crunching. Twigs snapping. Closer this time. I grabbed my flashlight but didn't turn it on yet. I waited. The steps circled my tent. I could hear them clearly now. Someone was walking around my camp. Not fast, just slow, almost curious. I finally turned on the flashlight and clicked it through the mesh of my tent. Nothing. I unzipped the flap and shined the beam outside. Nothing moved. Trees and shadows. My heart was hammering so loud it felt like it filled the whole forest. I stepped out, scanned everything. No one. No fresh footprints, though the ground was firm and covered in pine needles, so that didn't mean much. My bear bag was still hanging, undisturbed. I didn't sleep again that night. I just sat with my back against a tree, flashlight in my lap, waiting for the sun. I should have turned around the next day. I know that now, but I didn't want to feel like I'd let fear win. I told myself it had to be an animal, or maybe I was dreaming. I packed up and pushed forward. The trail was harder to follow now, more overgrown. I had to cut through thickets of mountain laurel and scramble over fallen logs. Around mid-afternoon, I came across something that made my stomach twist. A campsite, but not like mine. This one looked abandoned. There was an old, faded blue tarp stretched between two trees, torn down the middle. A metal pot, rusted and half buried in dirt, lay near a fire pit full of wet ashes. There was a backpack, its contents spilled out, mostly ruined by weather and animals. Moldy clothes, a cracked flashlight, some old trail mix bags torn open. But what really got me was the sleeping bag. It was still inside the tent. A small, one-person nylon dome, but it had been slashed down the middle like with a knife. The foam pad underneath was shredded too. I couldn't see any blood, but the whole thing felt wrong. It looked like whoever had been there left in a hurry, or was forced out. I stood there for a while, just staring, trying to make sense of it. Then I noticed something scratched into the tree nearby. Just a simple word, "No." I didn't take a picture. I didn't want to have anything to do with it. I just turned around and started hiking back the way I came, fast and alert. I told myself I'd hike until dark, then camp just one more night before making it back to the car the next day. But I didn't make it far. I got maybe a mile and a half before I realized something was wrong. The trail wasn't where it should have been. I should have reached the edge of a small clearing with a rock formation I'd passed on the way up. But it wasn't there. I backtracked, looked for my markers, but nothing looked familiar. Somehow I had veered off the trail even though I'd been so careful. I checked my compass. It didn't make sense. Everything looked the same: trees, rocks, underbrush. I couldn't find anything I recognized. I started to panic then. Real panic. Not just nerves, but that deep kind of fear that takes over when your brain realizes you're truly, utterly lost. The sun was starting to dip. I didn't want to hike blind, so I picked a flat patch of ground and set up camp again. I skipped dinner. I didn't feel like eating. I just sat there with my flashlight, my knife, and a horrible pit in my gut. That night, the footsteps came back. They started just after midnight. Same slow, deliberate steps. Not circling this time, just approaching. From the woods, straight toward my tent. I held my breath, gripping the flashlight. I didn't dare move. The steps stopped just outside. Then silence. I don't know how long I sat there. Could have been minutes. Could have been an hour. Eventually, I forced myself to unzip the tent and shine the light outside. Again, nothing. No person, no animal, no tracks. But the food bag was gone. Just gone. The rope had been cut, clean through. Not chewed, cut. I stayed up until dawn, then packed everything and started walking. I had no idea which direction to go. I followed the sun west, hoping I'd eventually hit a trail or a road or something. The forest felt different now, heavier. I kept looking over my shoulder, sure I'd see someone following me. I never did. By midday, I was exhausted. I hadn't eaten, hadn't slept. I was almost out of water. That's when I found the clearing. It was a wide, flat meadow, maybe the size of a football field, ringed by tall trees. There was a cabin near the far edge, small, old, with a sagging porch and one broken window. I didn't want to go near it, but I didn't have many options. I needed water and maybe a clue about where the hell I was. I approached slowly, looking for signs of life. No smoke, no movement. The door hung open on one hinge. I stepped inside. It was empty, mostly. There was an old cot against the far wall, a rusted stove, and a wooden table with a moldy blanket draped over it. But what got me was the wall. One entire wall was covered in names. Hundreds of them, scratched into the wood, some with knives, some with markers. First names, last names, initials. A few had dates next to them. None were later than 2004. There was one more thing, too. A small pile of items in the corner. Keys, wallets, phones, dozens of them, all dead, all weather-worn. I was 32 when it happened, and I still think about it more often than I'd like to admit. The memory always creeps back in when I'm alone in the woods or when I hear twigs snapping at night. It happened in early August 2019. I had taken a few weeks off work after finishing a long and stressful project. I needed a reset, no phone, no emails, no people. So I packed up my gear and drove up to a spot near Arrowhead Lake in Montana, a place I'd been to once before with a buddy 2 years earlier. It's not too popular, not too far off-grid, and there's a small Forest Service road that cuts through thick woods to a hidden clearing near the lake's edge. The road is bumpy, narrow, and barely maintained, but I liked that. Kept the crowds away. I planned to stay 4 nights. I had a big cooler of food, enough water, a good tent, tools, and my old 9mm pistol in the glove box, just in case. I wasn't expecting trouble. I just liked being prepared. I arrived around 4 p.m. that first day, set up my tent under the tall lodgepole pines, and spent the rest of the evening cooking a simple meal over the campfire. Everything felt calm. The woods were quiet, just the distant call of a hawk and the occasional rustle of small animals in the brush. That first night was peaceful. I slept hard, the way you do after a long drive in fresh air. But the next day, things started to feel off, though I didn't realize it until later. I woke early before sunrise. The morning air was cool and damp, the grass wet with dew. I made coffee on my little camp stove and took a walk down to the lake with my mug in hand. There was a low fog hugging the water, and the trees looked like shadows behind it. I didn't see anyone else, which was normal for this spot. You usually don't run into other campers unless it's the weekend. After breakfast, I decided to hike a few miles up one of the unmarked trails behind my campsite. I wanted to scout out a good spot for wildlife watching later in the evening. I carried my day pack with water, some granola bars, and my hunting knife. Not because I was hunting, but because a blade is always useful in the woods. About 2 miles in, I found a ridge that looked out over a small valley. Perfect spot. I marked it on my GPS and turned back. That's when I noticed something strange. A tree near the trail had been carved. Just a small mark, nothing dramatic, but it wasn't natural. It was a thin vertical line about eye level, and below it, a sideways X. It looked fresh. No moss growing in the cut. No weathering. It didn't seem like much at the time. People leave weird signs in the woods sometimes. Could be anything, a hiker marking their path, or even just a bored kid. I didn't give it more thought than that. I got back to camp by early afternoon, ate lunch, read a bit, then hiked back out to the ridge for sunset. It was beautiful. The sky lit up in oranges and purples, and the valley below turned to shadow. I waited until twilight, hoping to spot deer or maybe even a bear in the distance, but nothing came. By the time I got back to camp, it was nearly dark. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up. I couldn't figure out why at first. There were no strange noises, no light, nothing obvious. Just this tight feeling in my chest, like something was off. Around 2 a.m., I sat up and listened. Silence. No wind. No insects. Not even the distant hoot of an owl. The silence is what really got to me. Even in the woods, there's always some noise at night. Crickets, leaves rustling, something. But this was dead quiet, like the forest was holding its breath. I stayed up another hour just listening, my hand resting on my flashlight, my heart beating a little faster than I wanted to admit. Eventually, I laid back down and forced myself to sleep. The next morning, I found something that made my skin crawl. Near the edge of the clearing where I'd parked my truck, maybe 30 feet from my tent, there were fresh footprints in the soft dirt. Human, adult-sized. They weren't mine. I checked. I wear size 12 boots, and these were smaller, probably a size 9 or 10. And barefoot. The prints came from the woods, stopped near my tent, and then turned around. Just a single set, like someone had walked up quietly, stood there for a while, then slipped back into the forest. I stared at them for a long time. Then I checked my tent, my truck, my gear. Everything was untouched. My food was still there. Nothing missing. I couldn't figure it out. If it was someone trying to steal, why leave empty-handed? Why barefoot? I thought about packing up and leaving. I really did. But I convinced myself it was probably just a weirdo hiker. Maybe high, maybe lost, maybe harmless. I didn't want to overreact. I had driven 6 hours to get here, and I still had 2 nights left. I moved my cooler and food into the truck, locked the doors, and kept my pistol on me the rest of the day. That evening, I didn't hike. I stayed in camp, fire burning bright, just sitting, listening. I thought maybe I imagined the footprints, or they were older than I realized. Maybe it wasn't a person at all. Maybe I just needed more sleep. That night was worse. I lay in my tent with my ears open. I didn't sleep. Around 1:30 a.m., I heard something outside. Not close at first, just footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching dry leaves, getting closer. I grabbed my flashlight and turned it on inside the tent, but I didn't unzip the door. I just sat still, listening. The steps circled the tent. Once, then again, a full circle. They stopped near the back of the tent. Nothing for a full minute. Then the zipper of the tent moved. Didn't open, just moved like someone touched it, tested it. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. Then footsteps again, slowly walking away into the trees. I sat there, frozen. I don't know how long I waited. At least an hour, maybe more. I didn't hear anything else. When the sky finally started to lighten, I got up, got dressed, and walked the entire camp perimeter. No sign of anyone, no more footprints, just silence. That was it for me. I decided I wasn't staying another night. I packed everything fast, shoved gear into bags without folding or sorting, and loaded the truck. By 8 a.m., I was ready to go. I sat in the driver's seat, keys in hand, when I noticed something small tucked under my wiper blade. It was a single Polaroid photo, blurry, crooked, but I knew what it was. It was a photo of me sitting by the campfire, taken from behind the trees. I stared at it for a long time, my stomach twisting. My face was in profile, the firelight on my cheek. I must have been reading. The photo was taken from about 20 feet away, and I never heard a sound. I didn't wait another second. I started the truck and backed out onto the Forest Service road, tires kicking up dust. The road is rough, full of rocks and roots, and I was bouncing so much I thought my gear would fly out the back. I didn't care. I just wanted distance. The drive back to civilization felt like forever. I kept checking the rear view, half expecting someone to follow me. But no one did. I made it to the nearest gas station around noon. I didn't say anything to the guy inside. I just used the bathroom, bought a sandwich, and got back in the truck. When I got home, I looked at the photo again. There was something else in it. In the shadows, behind the trees, barely visible, was a second figure. Hard to see, just a shape, a silhouette. Could have been anything, but I knew. I filed a report with the sheriff's office, told them everything, gave them the photo. They took it seriously, sent someone out to check the area, but I never heard back. A month later, I called to follow up. They told me they didn't find anything. No signs of other camps, no prints, no trash, nothing. The ranger who went out said it looked undisturbed, like no one had been there at all. I still think about that place. I still wonder who was out there, what they wanted, why they watched me, why they took a photo, and why there were 2 of them. But more than anything, I wonder what would have happened if I had stayed one more night. It was the summer of 2017. I was 34 years old, working as a freelance photographer, mostly doing nature work. That year, I had taken on fewer assignments to make space for personal projects. One of those projects was to explore lesser-known camping spots in the western part of Colorado and photograph them in different lighting, sunrise, sunset, and under overcast skies. I had a decent 4x4 and a set of sturdy camping gear I'd built up over the years. I wasn't new to camping. I'd spent weeks alone in remote forests, on mountain trails, and even desert edges. I was confident in my skills: navigation, first aid, building fires, filtering water, you name it. I'd never had a real scare before, not even close. There was this area I'd been reading about online called Echo Valley. It wasn't in any big tourist guides. Just a handful of off-the-grid forums mentioned it. Supposedly, it was a forgotten trail near the western slope of the Uncompahgre Plateau, surrounded by steep hills, pine trees, and a creek that ran year-round. Some folks said it used to be a scout campsite back in the 80s, but after a bad flood, people stopped going. No one I personally knew had been there. That's what pulled me in. I planned a 3-day solo trip. I packed light but carefully: tent, sleeping bag, knife, bear spray, a .357 revolver I always brought on remote trips, portable stove, water purifier, satellite phone, and extra batteries. I loaded up my truck with food sealed in odor-proof bags and headed out on a Monday morning. It was early August, hot during the day, but the nights were cold up there. I reached the nearest service road by mid-afternoon, then drove another 40 minutes on a barely visible dirt path until I couldn't go further without risking damage to the truck. From there, it was a 2-hour hike into the woods. The path was overgrown but visible enough if you looked for broken branches or slight indentations in the grass. I followed the creek upstream as suggested in the forums. By the time I reached a decent flat area next to the creek, it was nearly 6 p.m. I set up camp fast, pitched the tent, gathered dry wood for a fire, and filtered water. There was a strange stillness in the air. The only sound was the water running over rocks and the occasional bird. No wind.
No insects buzzing.
Just quiet. I chalked it up to being deep in the valley, away from everything. That first night was uneventful. I made a small fire, heated up a can of chili, and sat with my back against a tree, watching the stars come out. Around 10 p.m., I turned in. The ground was firm but not too rocky. I slept well. The second day I spent exploring. I walked a couple of miles in each direction along the creek, taking photos and marking my path with biodegradable tape so I could find my way back. I noticed some old fire rings and metal stakes in the ground, signs people had camped here years ago. At one point, I found a rusted-out Coleman stove buried under leaves. That confirmed the scout camp theory. Around late afternoon, I hiked up a ridge on the north side of the valley to get a wide-angle photo of the area. That's when I saw something that made me stop. Across the valley, maybe half a mile away, near the tree line, I saw a glint, like light reflecting off glass or metal. It was brief, maybe half a second, but enough to catch my attention. I stared for a while, waiting to see it again, but nothing moved. I figured it could be an old beer bottle or maybe a deer moving through a sunbeam. I took a few photos and headed back down before the light disappeared. That night, after dinner, I sat by the fire again. The same stillness surrounded me. At one point, I thought I heard a soft cracking sound in the distance, like a branch snapping under weight, but it didn't repeat, and I've heard branches fall on their own plenty of times. Still, I kept the revolver closer to my sleeping bag than usual. I woke up sometime after midnight. I didn't know what exactly woke me, but my eyes shot open. My tent was closed, and everything was quiet. Too quiet. The creek sounded muffled, like something was dampening the air. I lay there for a minute, listening, holding my breath. Then I heard it again. A soft crunch, like footsteps on dry leaves, not too far from the tent. Now, footsteps in the woods don't always mean danger. Deer walk through camps. Raccoons snoop around. But these steps were slow and deliberate: step, pause, step, pause. I sat up slowly, grabbed the revolver, and unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. I couldn't see anything. It was pitch black except for the moonlight filtering through the pines. The fire was out, just embers. I stayed like that for about 5 minutes, staring into the woods, heart pounding. Nothing moved. Eventually, the steps faded. I didn't hear them leave, just nothing again. I stayed awake until dawn, lying still, gun in hand, ears straining. As the sky lightened, birds returned, and the normal forest sounds came back. It was like whatever had been near was gone with the dark. I got up, made coffee, and checked the perimeter. No tracks, no broken branches, no sign of animals or people. I debated cutting the trip short, but stubbornness won out. I told myself it was probably a deer or maybe just my nerves. Still, I didn't stray too far that third day. I stayed close to camp, kept the fire going, and spent more time watching than taking pictures. Around noon, I heard something faint in the distance. Sounded like metal clanging. Not loud, but out of place. I couldn't place the direction. It lasted maybe 2 seconds and stopped. No echo, no follow-up. I climbed back up the ridge that evening, hoping to catch the sunset and maybe figure out what I'd seen the day before. This time, I brought my telephoto lens. I scanned the tree line where I'd seen the glint. Nothing. But when I looked slightly west of that spot, I noticed something odd. A small structure barely visible between trees. It looked like wood, maybe a shed or an old cabin. I hadn't noticed it before, probably hidden by the angle or lighting. I zoomed in and snapped a few photos. The building looked weathered, almost collapsed in parts. But what really got me was a figure, a person, standing outside it, dressed in dark clothes, still as stone, facing the valley. I froze. The distance was too far to see details, but this wasn't a hunter. No orange vest, no gear, just a lone figure staring. I packed up fast and rushed down the ridge, heart racing. I didn't run. I didn't want to draw attention, but I moved fast. Back at camp, I didn't eat. I doused the fire early and climbed into the tent just before sunset. I kept the gun in my hand. I didn't sleep. All night I listened. I heard rustling a few times, faint sounds, too far to pinpoint. Once I thought I heard breathing outside the tent. Not loud, but close enough that I held my breath and didn't move for 10 minutes. By morning, I'd had enough. I packed everything up by 6 a.m., barely stopping to eat. I loaded my gear and began the hike back to the truck. I checked behind me every few minutes. My nerves were shredded. When I reached the truck and locked the doors, I sat there for 5 minutes, just breathing. I started the engine and took off down the dirt road, only slowing when I hit pavement again. I drove straight to the nearest town, Montrose, checked into a cheap motel and showered for an hour. Later that night, I looked through the photos I'd taken. The structure was clearer in one of the shots. Definitely a shed or one-room cabin. The figure, though, it was gone. In the photo, there was no one there, just trees. I could have sworn I saw someone. I stared at it for hours, zoomed in, changed contrast, brightness, nothing. I reported the cabin to the ranger station the next day, told them I thought someone might be squatting out there and acting strangely. They said they'd look into it. I never heard back. I never went back to Echo Valley. I still go camping, but I stick to known areas now, trails with other people nearby. That trip changed something in me. It wasn't fear of animals or getting lost. It was the silence, the way the air felt wrong, the way someone or something moved through those woods without making a sound when it wanted to. I don't believe in ghosts or monsters. I believe in people, and I think someone was watching me out there. Maybe they lived there. Maybe they didn't like visitors. Maybe they were just waiting to see what I'd do. I didn't stay long enough to find out, and I never will. It was early September of 2017 when I decided I needed a break from the city. I had just turned 31, and life had been pulling me in too many directions at once. I worked in insurance, mostly behind a desk, trapped under fluorescent lights, and answering calls from angry people who didn't read their policies. I had no family in the city, few friends, and the kind of persistent fatigue that builds up slowly over the years without you even realizing it. One morning, I stared at my face in the mirror, pale from the artificial light and lack of sun, and said to myself, I need out. So I booked a week off work, packed up my car with some basic gear, and drove north. I didn't have a solid plan, just a general direction. I ended up in northern Oregon, near the border with Washington. I'd found a place on an old backpacking forum, not an official campground, more of a local spot known among hikers and loners. It was called Seven Pines Ridge. The guy who posted about it said it was quiet, isolated, and beautiful. A ridge that ran along a forgotten section of forest just off an old logging road, with a small stream running through it. Sounded perfect. No people, no signal, and no noise. Took me nearly 5 hours to get there. I left Portland around 6 in the morning, took I-5 north, then veered off onto a bunch of state routes that twisted through small, almost forgotten towns. By the time I turned off the paved road onto the dirt track that led to the ridge, my GPS had stopped working. I didn't mind. That was kind of the point. The dirt road was rough. My old Subaru groaned over rocks and dipped into deep ruts, the kind that make your stomach rise just a bit if you go too fast. Trees pressed in from both sides. The forest felt old, damp, and undisturbed. I passed a rusted sign nailed to a post. Asterisk, 7 Pines Ridge Trailhead, no services. Asterisk, it was tilted. The lettering faded. I parked in a small clearing that barely fit my car, grabbed my backpack, and headed in on foot. The trail was narrow but visible. Moss covered almost everything, trees, rocks, even fallen logs. After about an hour of hiking, I found a flat patch near the stream, not far from the ridge's edge, where the trees thinned just enough to get a sliver of a view to the west. You could see rolling tree-covered hills that stretched out for miles. It was perfect. I set up my tent, built a small fire ring from nearby stones, and sat on a fallen log, just listening. No cars, no people, just wind in the branches and water trickling through roots and rocks. The first night was uneventful. I cooked some beans on my little camp stove, drank water from my filter bottle, and wrote in a small notebook. I slept surprisingly well. The air was cold, but fresh. I woke with the sun, sore from the ground, but clear-headed for the first time in months. The second day, I hiked further up the ridge. I didn't see a soul. There were no wrappers, no fire pits, no beer cans. Signs I'd come to expect even in untouched areas. This really was remote. I found some deer tracks near the stream and once saw what I thought might have been a coyote, but it darted away before I could get a good look. That night, I stayed up later. The stars were insane. No light pollution, just a sky bursting with pinpoints of white, a dome of silent infinity overhead. It was the third night when things started to feel off. It began with a sound. I just crawled into my sleeping bag. The fire had burned low, just red coals glowing faintly. I was halfway between sleep and wakefulness when I heard it. A snap, not a twig underfoot, not that sharp dry crack, but more like a dull pop, like a thick branch being twisted and broken. I sat up, listened. The forest was still, but not silent. Crickets chirped. Something small moved through leaves nearby, probably a squirrel. But then I heard another sound, closer this time. A slow crunching like footsteps, heavy, deliberate ones, then silence. I told myself it was just an animal, a deer maybe, or an elk. But I'd grown up hiking in Montana. I knew the sound of animals moving through brush. These weren't quick, light, or erratic. They were slow and spaced like someone walking. I stayed still, hand resting on the knife by my pack. I didn't sleep much that night, just lay there, ears straining in the dark. Morning came and everything looked normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling. I walked the perimeter around my site, didn't find any footprints, but I did find something odd. A tree about 30 yards from my tent, freshly gouged with marks. Not scratches, not like claws, but long vertical lines that looked like they'd been made with a blade. Clean, deliberate cuts, 3 of them evenly spaced. I told myself it could have been old damage. I told myself I hadn't noticed it earlier. I went about my day as usual, hiked some, collected wood, filtered more water, but I kept glancing at that tree. That night it rained. Not heavy, just a cold drizzle that crept into your clothes and stuck. I stayed in my tent, wrapped in my bag, reading a paperback. Around 1 a.m., I heard the footsteps again, closer this time. This time there was no wind to blame, no dry branches to snap in the breeze. The sound came from just beyond my tent, from the direction of the stream. It moved slowly, deliberately, circling wide. I lay frozen. My knife was under my pillow. I slid my hand toward it, heart hammering. Then I heard a low thud, like something being dropped, followed by silence. I didn't sleep. When the sky finally lightened, I stepped out. The drizzle had stopped. The forest smelled like wet leaves and earth. At the edge of the stream, I saw it, a pile of rocks, stacked deliberately, 5 of them, each one placed with precision like a little monument that hadn't been there the day before. I was sure of it. Now I started to feel genuinely unsettled. Someone was nearby. I packed my things fast, took down the tent, shoved everything into my backpack, and headed back down the trail. I figured I could make it to the car in under an hour if I moved fast. But about 15 minutes in, I stopped cold. There were boot prints in the mud, deep ones, fresh, leading toward my campsite. They weren't mine. I wear trail runners. These were heavier, like work boots, treaded, large, size 11, maybe 12. They weren't there when I came in. I felt like I was being watched. I started walking faster. Every sound behind me made my skin crawl. At one point, I even broke into a jog, heart pounding. When I finally reached the clearing, my car was there, untouched. No signs of anyone else. But I didn't feel safe until I was back on the paved road, reception bars lighting up on my phone. I drove to the nearest town, a place called Oak Hollow. Tiny. A single gas station, a diner, and a post office. I sat in the diner for an hour, just nursing coffee and staring at the table. My thoughts were racing. Was it a hunter? A drifter? Someone living off-grid? Why come so close to my tent? Why leave the rock pile? Eventually, I booked a room at a motel and stayed the night. I couldn't go back to the ridge, and I didn't want to go home yet either. I needed to clear my head. But the story doesn't end there. A week later, back in Portland, I kept thinking about it. I told myself I'd imagined things. Maybe I'd been on edge, sleep deprived, but I couldn't stop wondering. So I did something I probably shouldn't have. I went online and searched for Seven Pines Ridge. Not the hiking forum, I went deeper. Old news stories, obscure blogs, local reports. That's when I found it. An article from 2004, archived in a local newspaper. A missing hiker, a man named Greg Walters, 29. He'd gone missing near Seven Pines Ridge. His car was found at the same clearing I'd parked at. Search and rescue found his tent, undisturbed. His gear was still there, but he was gone, never found. There was another case, 2011. A woman, same spot. Her tent was slashed open. Her pack was found a mile away. She was later found wandering the forest, barefoot, incoherent. She'd refused to speak to authorities. Eventually ended up in a psychiatric facility. I felt sick. This wasn't just in my head. I never went back. I sold the camping gear, changed my car, moved to a different apartment. I don't even go to public parks anymore. I still think about that third night. The sound of the steps, the rock pile, the knife marks in the tree. Someone was there watching me, not trying to kill me, just watching, waiting. And that's what haunts me the most. It wasn't what happened. It's what could have happened if I had stayed one more night. I was 29 when I decided to do something a bit different for my vacation. It was 2017, and I'd been working nonstop at my job as a welder in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. The long hours, the noise, the heat. I needed to get away from all of it. So I planned a week-long solo camping trip deep in the Allegheny National Forest. I'd gone camping before, but always in designated campgrounds, the kind with other families, fire pits, and nearby rangers. This time, I wanted something quieter. I didn't want to hear other people's kids screaming or their music blasting. I wanted real solitude, just me, nature, and time to think. I picked a remote patch of forest near the Clarion River. I found it using old trail maps and a few online forums where hardcore backpackers traded GPS coordinates like secrets. This spot was far from the marked trails, about a 6-hour hike from the nearest road. I figured if anything went wrong, I had my satellite phone, a good knife, bear spray, and a well-stocked first aid kit. I got there on a Monday afternoon in late September. The air was cool, crisp. Fall was just starting to show, with some of the leaves turning red and orange. The forest was dead quiet except for the occasional sound of birds and the steady crunch of my boots over dry leaves. After hiking most of the day, I reached the clearing where I'd planned to set up camp. It was perfect. A flat area tucked between tall pines, about 100 yards from the river. I set up my tent, filtered some water, made a small fire with sticks and pine needles, and cooked a simple meal of beans and rice over my camping stove. I sat by the fire until it got dark, then crawled into my sleeping bag and passed out almost instantly. The first 2 days were peaceful. I hiked during the day, explored nearby rock formations, fished in the river, and took a lot of photos. At night, I'd return to camp, cook, clean up, and fall asleep. Everything was going exactly how I wanted. Quiet, peaceful. But on the third night, something changed. I was sitting by the fire after dinner, just staring into the flames when I heard something. It was faint, maybe 100 feet into the woods. It sounded like a twig snapping, not an animal rustling, but a distinct single crack. I froze. I listened hard, but I didn't hear anything else. I figured it was probably a deer. There were a lot of them around, and they're not exactly graceful when they move through the brush. Still, I kept my knife close when I crawled into the tent. I didn't feel scared exactly, just a little more aware. The next morning, I walked out to gather more firewood. As I was heading back toward camp, I noticed something strange. A few branches near my tent looked bent, like something heavy had stepped on them. There were also some scuffed leaves near the edge of the clearing. I crouched down and looked closer, but I didn't see any tracks. The ground was too hard and dry. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a bear sniffing around at night while I was asleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Bears don't usually get that close to a fire, and I hadn't seen any signs of them nearby. I didn't think too much more about it during the day. I went on another hike and came back before sunset. I cooked, cleaned, and sat by the fire like usual, but I kept my head on a swivel. Every little noise in the woods had my attention. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up, listening. At one point, around 3 a.m., I thought I heard something moving outside the tent. Slow, careful steps, then nothing. I stayed still, holding my breath, clutching the knife under my sleeping bag. I must have stayed like that for over an hour, waiting for something to happen. Nothing ever did. In the morning, I checked around the tent. Nothing obvious. No prints, no damage, no signs of anyone or anything. But I still felt watched. I couldn't explain it, but the hairs on my arms kept standing up, like something was nearby. That day, I didn't leave camp. I kept a small fire going and stayed alert. I didn't want to spook myself into thinking there was someone out there, but I also didn't want to be caught off guard. I kept telling myself I was being paranoid. I was halfway through a can of soup when I noticed something hanging from a tree about 30 yards out. It looked like a strip of cloth. I walked over and saw it was a torn piece of gray t-shirt, stuck on a branch about 5 feet off the ground. It was frayed like it had been ripped. My stomach dropped. There shouldn't have been anyone else out here. I hadn't seen a soul in days, and this spot wasn't on any main trail. That's why I'd picked it. I walked the area, looking for other signs, footprints, gear, anything. Nothing. I decided then that I would leave the next morning. I packed up most of my stuff that night and kept my fire burning longer than usual. I didn't want to stay another night, but hiking back in the dark was too dangerous. I figured if someone was messing around, they'd see I was alert and armed. Around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, but this time they were closer. I turned off my lantern, sat still in the dark, and listened. The fire had died down to just embers, so I couldn't see much. The steps stopped just outside the tent. My heart was racing. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. Then I heard what sounded like someone kneeling. Faint rustling, then silence. I stayed frozen until the sun came up. When I finally got the nerve to crawl out, I saw nothing. But about 10 feet from my tent, there was a small pile of rocks stacked into a tiny pyramid. 3 rocks carefully balanced. I hadn't done that. I didn't eat breakfast. I grabbed my gear, tore down the tent in minutes, and stuffed everything into my pack. I didn't even fold anything. I just got it all in and got the hell out of there. I started hiking fast, trying not to run, but moving as quickly as I could while keeping an eye on my surroundings. The woods felt different, heavier. I kept looking over my shoulder, sure I was going to see someone standing just out of view. A few miles into the hike, I stopped to catch my breath. That's when I noticed something new. A cigarette, but on the ground. It was still fresh, white filter, barely crushed. Someone had been there not long before me. Maybe hours, maybe less. I hadn't seen any smoke or smelled anything during my time out there. I don't smoke, and I hadn't passed anyone on the way in. That meant someone had been following me or camping nearby, hidden. I didn't stop again. I hiked the rest of the day until I reached the dirt road where I'd parked. My truck was untouched, still there. I drove straight to a gas station about 30 miles away and sat in the lot for almost an hour, just breathing, watching people come and go. I never called the police. What would I say? That someone stacked some rocks near my tent and dropped a cigarette butt? That I felt watched? There wasn't enough to make a report. And honestly, I just wanted to forget about it. But even now, years later, I still think about it. I still wonder who was out there. I think about the slow footsteps, the ripped shirt, the cigarette, the rocks. Someone else had been in that forest and they knew I was there. They knew where I was sleeping. They watched me. They stayed hidden. And they didn't do anything. That's what haunts me. They didn't try to rob me, didn't attack. They just watched, waited. Maybe they were trying to scare me. Maybe they were planning something and changed their mind. Or maybe they were just off, a drifter, a survivalist, someone who didn't want to be found and didn't like me being there. I never went back. I still camp, but only in public campgrounds. Places with people, rangers, lights. I miss the solitude, but I don't trust it anymore. Out there, far from everything, there's no one to help if something goes wrong. No one to stop someone from creeping around your tent at night. No one to ask why they were there or what they wanted. I still remember the weight of that silence, the feeling of being watched, the steps outside the tent, and I always will. I went camping alone in the summer of 2017. I was 29 at the time, living in Bozeman, Montana. I'd always been into hiking, especially backcountry stuff where you don't see other people for days. I worked as a freelance mechanic, mostly out of my garage, so I had the flexibility to plan trips around weather and clients. That summer had been a string of hot days and clear skies, so I decided to head to the Tobacco Root Mountains for a few nights. I'd been there before, but never this deep. I planned a 3-day hike, starting from South Meadow Creek Trailhead. My destination was a ridge just west of Hollowtop Lake. It wasn't on the main trail. I had found it months earlier on a satellite map. Looked secluded and scenic. I wanted quiet, real quiet, the kind that makes you notice the sound of your own heartbeat. I packed my gear the night before, nothing fancy, just the basics. Tent, food, first aid, emergency GPS, bear spray, a knife, and my old 9mm pistol. I'd carried the pistol since my early 20s, but never had to use it for anything more than scaring off a raccoon. I always brought it. It made me feel better being out there alone. I had 3 days worth of dehydrated meals, a compact stove, a full water bladder, and iodine tablets just in case. My phone was fully charged, but I knew it wouldn't have reception where I was going. I left the next morning around 5:30 a.m., drove out in my old Tacoma, and reached the trailhead by 8. There were only 2 other cars in the lot. I signed the trail register and started my hike. Weather was perfect, mid-70s. Dry, barely any wind. The first 6 miles were easy, mostly open meadows and pine forests. I passed one older couple heading back the other way. We waved but didn't stop. That was the last person I saw for the entire trip. I left the main trail around noon, veering off toward the ridge I'd marked on my map. The terrain started changing, rockier, steeper. By 3 p.m., I reached a small plateau halfway up the ridge. It wasn't flat, but there was enough level ground to pitch my tent. I had a view of the entire valley below, a dense line of forest running up both sides. I could see the lake in the distance, almost black under the sun. I made a quick meal, set up camp, and just sat there for a while, letting the silence wash over me. No cars, no people, no sounds but wind through pine and the occasional chirp of birds. It was the kind of peace you don't get anywhere near civilization. Night came fast in the mountains. By 9 p.m., the sky was black and the stars came out like pinholes in a dark curtain. I crawled into my sleeping bag and was out cold by 10. First night was uneventful, except for some strange creaking sounds outside my tent around 3 a.m. I figured it was a deer or something brushing past a tree. I didn't get up to check. I was too tired to care. The second day started smooth. I hiked farther up the ridge in the morning. No pack, just water and a snack. I found a shallow rock overhang near the peak and made a mental note of it in case weather turned. Got back to camp around 1 p.m., boiled water for a meal, and was sitting in the shade when I saw something odd down in the trees. About 200 yards down the slope, something was moving between the pines, not fast but deliberate. I squinted and waited for a better view. Could have been a bear, but it was upright. Not fully, more like crouched, weaving between the trees slowly. I stayed still, not breathing, trying to track it. It moved behind a boulder and didn't come out the other side. I waited a full minute. Nothing. I pulled out my binoculars but saw only trees and stone. I scanned the area for 10 more minutes and saw nothing else. I told myself it was probably a hunter or another camper, maybe someone gathering firewood. Still, it sat wrong in my gut. I kept my pistol on me for the rest of the afternoon, even while boiling water or lying in my tent. That evening, things felt off. Wind shifted directions. Birds stopped chirping. It was like the whole mountain took a breath and held it. I started hearing light snapping sounds from the treeline again, just like the night before, but this time more frequent, closer. I shouted once, just to see if anyone would respond. Nothing. No echo, no movement. That night, I barely slept. I laid there, pistol in hand, eyes open in the dark, listening. The third morning was cold, much colder than the previous days. The kind of cold that gets into your fingernails. I packed up early, thinking I'd hike back to the truck and call it. I wasn't enjoying myself anymore. I felt watched, followed even. I was about to collapse my tent when I noticed boot prints behind it. Fresh. Not mine. Heavier tread, wider gait. They came from the treeline, circled my camp, and left the way they came. I stood there staring at them, not moving. My chest tightened. I hadn't heard anyone approach during the night. No voices. No lights. Just those soft snaps. I grabbed my gear and started down the ridge fast, skipping breakfast. I took the same route I came up, cutting through the same stretch of trees. Every sound set me on edge. A pine cone dropping felt like a gunshot. My steps were fast, sloppy. I tripped more than once. At one point, I heard movement behind me. Branches crunching, not close, but not far either. I spun around, eyes scanning the trees. Nothing. I waited in total silence. After 2 minutes, it stopped. I started moving again, slower this time, back against the slope. By noon, I was close to where the ridge rejoined the main trail, maybe 20 minutes out. That's when I found the shirt, caught on a low branch, half torn, stained dark red in a few places. It was flannel, the kind you find in every outdoor store. There was no smell, no blood on the ground, just the shirt hanging like bait. I didn't touch it. I stared for a long time, then moved past it wide, keeping my back to a tree. When I reached the main trail, I nearly broke into a run. I don't remember much of that last stretch, just the thudding in my chest and the way the woods seemed darker than before. The parking lot was empty when I got back. No cars, not even mine. That's when I realized I'd parked farther down the trail access road, where there was overflow parking. I almost laughed from the panic that hit me when I didn't see my truck. I walked another 5 minutes and saw it, just where I'd left it. Everything was as I had left it. I checked the doors, the bed, even underneath. Nothing was missing. Nothing was placed there either, which I half expected for some reason. I got in and locked the doors. The drive back to Bozeman was 2 hours. I didn't stop once. I didn't look in the rearview mirror more than I had to. I got home, dumped my gear in the garage, locked every door and window in the house, and sat on my couch until the sun went down. I didn't sleep well for weeks. Every sound in the house made me jump. I kept checking the windows. I even set up a motion light in my backyard. A few days later, I reported the shirt to the local Forest Service office. I didn't mention the footprints or the feeling of being followed. Just said I'd found a piece of torn clothing near Hollowtop Lake. They said they'd send a ranger to check it out. I never heard back. That trip changed something in me. I still go hiking, but not alone. Not anymore. I stay on marked trails. I carry a satellite phone now, not just a GPS beacon. And I haven't gone back to the tobacco routes since. Some people think that fear is about monsters or ghosts or haunted cabins. It's not. Real fear is the knowledge that someone else is out there with you in the silence. Watching, waiting, never saying a word. That's what I felt up there. Not a ghost, not a bear, a man. A stranger who knew I was there, who circled my camp, who walked those same woods in total silence. That was real. And I think if I'd stayed one more night, I wouldn't be writing this. I still think about what happened in the summer of 2016 more than I'd like to admit. Sometimes it hits me at night when I'm lying in bed and hear a branch knock against the window. Other times it creeps up when I'm walking alone and hear footsteps behind me. It never leaves. I guess it won't ever leave. I was 27 back then, working a desk job in Houston that drained the life out of me. I was just another number in a line of cubicles, filing reports, answering emails, and waiting for the next lunch break like it was a vacation. I didn't hate the job, but I hated the routine. Every week felt like a repeat of the one before. That summer, I was long overdue for a break. I decided I needed a few days away from the screens, away from the noise, just silence and nature. I'd been reading about Big Bend Ranch State Park in southwest Texas, different from the national park everyone flocks to. This rugged, huge, and not as crowded. Perfect place to just unplug and breathe for a bit. I planned to go solo, not because I didn't have friends to come with, but because I genuinely wanted to be alone. I'd done a few solo hikes before, mostly weekend trips to places like Sam Houston National Forest, but this would be my first extended solo camping trip. For nights, 5 days, just me, a tent, and enough supplies to stay alive. I packed carefully. Tent, sleeping bag, stove, freeze-dried food, 2 5-gallon water jugs, a filter, satellite phone just in case, and a Ruger LCP .380 pistol. I wasn't expecting trouble, but out in the middle of nowhere, you're the only one looking out for yourself. I never go into the wilderness unarmed. I left Houston early in the morning, drove nearly 10 hours, stopping only for gas and a quick bite. I reached the visitor center near Presidio around 4 p.m. The ranger at the desk gave me a permit and a map with marked backcountry campsites. I chose one near Fresno Canyon, remote, with good views and supposedly no one else nearby that week. Exactly what I wanted. The first night was peaceful. I pitched the tent about a quarter mile off the trail, just far enough to feel truly alone. I cooked a simple meal, watched the sunset, and listened to the quiet. That's one thing people don't understand about the desert. It's not dead silent. It's full of subtle sounds. Wind rustling dry shrubs, insects clicking, distant howls you can't always identify. But it's not city noise. It's clean, open. It felt good to sit there, doing nothing but existing. The second day, I hiked further into the canyon. I saw no one. No footprints, no trash, no voices. Just rock, sky, and sand. I took pictures, scribbled a few thoughts in a pocket notebook, ate lunch by a small dry creek bed. Felt like I had the world to myself. When I got back to the tent that evening, though, something felt off. It wasn't anything dramatic, nothing obvious. My gear was still there. The tent flap was closed. My food bag was tied high in a tree to keep away animals. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, like I'd walked into a room someone had just left. The air felt different. Still, I told myself I was just tired. That kind of paranoia happens when you're alone too long. Your brain starts making stories out of shadows. I ate dinner, locked the pistol in my tent pocket, and went to bed early. That night, I heard footsteps. I know what deer sound like. I know how coyotes move through brush. This was different. 2 feet, deliberate steps. Crunch, pause, crunch, pause. I froze inside the sleeping bag. I didn't dare unzip the tent or make a sound. I just waited, ears straining, heart pounding so hard it echoed in my skull. The steps stopped right outside the tent. I couldn't see anything, obviously. My tent is one of those small, single-person types, low profile, no windows. I reached slowly for the pistol, gripped it tight, kept it under the sleeping bag. My finger rested on the trigger. Whoever it was didn't speak, didn't try to open the tent, just stood there. Then the steps retreated, slowly, one crunch at a time. I stayed awake the rest of the night. When morning finally came, I got out cautiously. Nothing was disturbed. No tracks that I could clearly make out. Just my gear sitting in the sun. I didn't know what to think. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe it was a big animal and my brain turned it into a person. Still, I felt shaken. I thought about packing up and leaving early, but I didn't want to quit on fear. I told myself I'd do one more night. If anything else weird happened, I'd leave the next morning. That third day, I stayed close to camp. I didn't wander far. I kept my pistol on me the entire time. I set up some simple tells. A few rocks balanced on top of each other around the perimeter. Some sticks laid across the path leading into the site. Nothing fancy, just enough to show if someone came through. I didn't hear footsteps that night, but something had changed. One of the sticks I laid down was snapped in half. Just one. No wind, no rain. I placed it flat across the path, undisturbed all day. Now it was broken. Clean snap. Nothing else was moved. My food bag was untouched. The rocks were still stacked. But that one stick, I packed everything up that morning. I didn't even eat breakfast. I didn't care about finishing the trip. I wanted out. The hike back was long, about 12 miles to the parking lot. Normally, that's not a big deal, but I was constantly looking over my shoulder, stopping to listen, adjusting my grip on the pistol. Every sound made me jump. Every movement in the distance made me freeze. I reached my car by mid-afternoon. I loaded everything in fast. I didn't even take off my boots. I got in, locked the doors, and drove. I didn't stop until I hit a gas station 3 hours away. I just sat there for a while, engine running, trying to breathe. Back in Houston, I told myself I'd imagined it all. Maybe I was just paranoid. Maybe isolation messed with my head. But then, 3 days later, something happened that brought it all back. I was cleaning out my gear in the garage, sorting through things, shaking out the tent, making sure nothing was moldy or chewed up. I opened the outside pocket of my pack where I kept the satellite phone. It was gone. I never used it. I checked it before the trip. Fully charged. I always pack it in the same spot, secured with a carabiner. Now it was just gone. Not misplaced. Asterisk gone star. I tore apart the garage looking for it. Checked the car, checked every bag. Nothing. Someone had taken it. Someone had gone through my pack while I was out of the campsite. Not to steal food or gear, but to quietly remove the one thing that could have called for help. It wasn't animals. It wasn't wind. It wasn't paranoia. It was a person that hit me harder than the footsteps or the broken stick. That realization that someone had been near me, close enough to go through my bag, to remove my lifeline and walk away without leaving a trace, shook me to my core. They didn't want to hurt me, not right away. They wanted to watch me. I started reading about similar cases, people going missing in parks. Not dramatic disappearances, but hikers found days later with packs opened, phones missing, sometimes never found at all. I couldn't prove any of it, but the patterns lined up. To this day, I don't know who was out there. A local living off-grid? Someone hiding in the wilderness? A random drifter with twisted hobbies? There's no way to know. The desert swallows evidence. Tracks don't last. There are miles and miles of nowhere out there where anything can happen. I never went camping alone again. I still hike sometimes, but always with someone, and always somewhere with cell service. I double-check my gear now. I carry a different pistol, heavier caliber. I've taken survival courses, learned tracking skills, built up muscle memory for emergencies. But nothing ever quite makes me feel safe like I used to feel before that trip. That trip changed something in me. I used to go into the wild to find peace. Now I go in with caution, and I never sleep without a loaded weapon close to hand. Not after what happened in Fresno Canyon. Not after knowing someone stood outside my tent, breathing, watching, planning. I made it out. I got lucky. Others might not. I was 27 when I decided to go camping alone for the first time. It wasn't some spontaneous idea. I'd been planning it for months, slowly gathering supplies, watching videos online, reading forums, learning as much as I could. I wanted to prove to myself I could do it. Not just survive in the woods, but really disconnect from everything. I had just left a job I hated, and before jumping into something new, I needed to clear my head. That's what I told myself, anyway. The spot I chose was a small patch of forest called Crooked Pine in northern Minnesota. It wasn't a big-name park, which was what I wanted. Fewer people, fewer distractions. Just thick trees, winding trails, and a shallow lake in the middle. I found the location through a guy's blog post who said it was a hidden gem, peaceful, and rarely visited. That sold me. I packed my gear, loaded up my 2011 Subaru, and made the 8-hour drive up there in early September. The weather was perfect when I arrived. It was warm but not hot, the kind of air that feels dry and clean. I parked my car off a narrow service road, maybe 2 miles from where I planned to camp. From there, I hiked in with my pack, which probably weighed close to 60 pounds. I was sweating within the first half hour, but I didn't care. I was excited, full of energy, just ready to be away from everything. I found the lake without trouble. It was small, still, and surrounded by pine trees that looked like they'd been twisted by the wind for decades. The blog post wasn't lying. It felt completely isolated. I picked a spot on the north side of the lake, cleared out some brush, and set up my tent. It took me a while, but when it was done, I stepped back and just stood there, looking at the water through the trees, listening to the wind rustle through the pines. I felt something close to peace. I hadn't felt that in a long time. The first night went by without anything unusual. I made a fire, cooked some instant noodles, and sat beside the flames until they burned low. The woods were loud, crickets, frogs, the occasional splash of something in the lake, but it was comforting in a way. I crawled into my sleeping bag and fell asleep fast. The second day I spent exploring. I brought a map, but it was an old one, and the trails weren't marked well. I stuck close to the lake just to be safe. I found some deer tracks, saw a fox in the distance, and came across an old hunting stand deep in the trees. It looked abandoned. Rusted nails, splintered wood, pieces of rope hanging from the sides. I snapped a picture of it with my phone and kept moving. By mid-afternoon, I was back at camp, sore but satisfied. That night, something felt a little off. I couldn't put my finger on it. The air had changed, colder maybe, or just heavier. I didn't sleep as well. I woke up a few times to the sound of snapping branches outside. Probably deer, I told myself. Maybe raccoons. But I noticed they weren't quick sounds. They weren't the frantic scrambling you'd expect from animals. It was slower, heavier, like footsteps. I tried not to think about it. I got up early the next morning, made coffee, and decided to hike further north, past the lake, where I hadn't explored yet. I followed what looked like an old logging trail, mostly overgrown now. It was hard walking, and after a couple hours, I stopped to eat a granola bar and drink some water. That's when I found the first sign that something wasn't right. It was a plastic water bottle, lying on the side of the trail. Not old and weathered, this was recent. Clean, still half full. No label, but clearly not something that had been sitting out for long. That struck me as strange, considering how remote the area was. I hadn't seen anyone. No cars near the trailhead. No voices. Nothing. I looked around but didn't see any more trash. Just that one bottle. I figured maybe a hiker dropped it. Still, I made a mental note of it and turned back toward my camp. When I got back that evening, I saw something that made my stomach twist. My tent was unzipped. Not all the way, just about halfway down. I know for a fact I zipped it up completely before I left. I always did. Bugs, animals, you don't want anything getting inside. I stood there for a few seconds, staring at it, trying to rationalize it. Maybe the zipper came loose somehow. Maybe I didn't do it right. But I knew I had. I approached slowly, pulling out my folding knife just in case. I peeked inside. Nothing looked disturbed at first. My sleeping bag was in place. My backpack was against the wall where I left it. But something was off. Couldn't place it. Then I saw it. The side pocket on my backpack was unzipped. It was where I kept my extra batteries and a small roll of duct tape. The batteries were still there, but the tape was gone. I stepped back out of the tent, scanned the trees, listening. Nothing but the usual wind and birds. But suddenly, the peace of the place felt like a lie, like something was just beneath the surface watching me. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the fire going longer than usual and sat with my back to a tree, holding the knife in my lap. I kept thinking about the zipper, the tape. Who would come out here and not take anything valuable? Why just the tape? The next morning, I packed up my tent. I wasn't planning to leave yet, but I didn't want to stay in the same spot. I moved about a mile west, closer to a ridge I'd noticed on my first hike. I figured it would give me a better view and maybe some peace of mind. I set up camp again and tried to relax. I didn't mention any of this to anyone. I had no signal, and even if I did, what would I say? Someone might have just stumbled across my camp, right? But then the knocking started. That night, after the fire died down and I got into the tent, I heard it. Sharp, quick knocks. 3 in a row. Then silence. At first I thought it was a branch falling, or maybe a woodpecker. But then it happened again. 3 knocks. Then again, 5 minutes later. Same rhythm, same tone. Not random, not natural. I didn't sleep at all. I just lay there, clutching the knife, listening. It went on until around 3 in the morning. Then it stopped. The next day I broke. I packed everything up. I was done. Whatever peace I'd come looking for, it was gone now, replaced by something cold and sharp in my gut. I didn't even bother eating. I just loaded up my pack and started hiking back toward the car. It should have taken 2 hours. Took almost 5. Not because I got lost. I didn't. But because someone had moved things along the trail. Branches had been placed across the path. Piles of stones where there hadn't been any before. At one point, I found a shirt, not mine, hanging from a low branch. Just a plain, dark blue t-shirt.
No logos.
No holes. Just hanging there like a flag. I pushed through it all, heart pounding, eyes scanning the trees. Every sound felt too loud. Every shadow too deep. When I finally saw my car through the trees, I almost cried. But even then, I wasn't safe. I reached for my keys in my jacket pocket. They weren't there. Panic hit me like a wave. I dropped my pack, tore through every pocket. Nothing. I opened the top of the pack, dumping everything out. Still nothing. I knew I'd put them in that jacket. I always kept them there. I was sure I was stuck, until I saw the note. It was under my windshield wiper. Just a torn piece of paper, folded in half. No envelope, no name. I opened it with shaking hands. Said, "Don't come back." That was it. My keys were under the driver's seat. I don't know how. I don't know when. But they were there, and that note, it wasn't soaked or dirty. Someone had been there that day. They'd been watching, waiting. I drove the whole way home without stopping. No gas, no food, just white knuckles on the steering wheel, eyes darting to the mirror every few seconds. It's been over a year now. I still think about it all the time. I don't go camping anymore. I sold the gear, the tent, everything. I don't hike either. I stay in cities now, surrounded by people, concrete, and streetlights. I don't trust silence anymore. I never figured out who it was. A hunter? A drifter? Someone living off the grid out there? Maybe they thought I was trespassing. Maybe they just liked scaring people. Or maybe they had worse plans and I got lucky. All I know is I listened. I haven't been back, and I never will. I was 32 when I decided I needed to get away from everything for a while. It was early fall 2019. I had been working long hours at a construction company in Pittsburgh, and I was burned out. I wasn't married, didn't have kids, and the idea of silence and being alone in the woods sounded perfect to me. I grew up camping with my uncle and cousins every summer, but I hadn't been out in years. I missed that peaceful feeling you only get when you're out there in the quiet, away from people, phones, deadlines. I took a week off and picked a spot I remembered going to as a teenager, Laurel Creek, tucked away in the hills of West Virginia. It wasn't on any major tourist maps. It was one of those areas you'd only know about if someone had taken you there. About a 3-hour drive south from where I lived. Then another 30 minutes down a narrow gravel road that eventually turned into dirt. The trail that led to the campsite wasn't marked. You had to know where the path split between 2 tall oaks and wind your way down along the creek. I packed light but smart tent, sleeping bag, knife, portable stove, 2 flashlights, extra batteries, food for 5 days, and a filtered water bottle. I also had a small revolver. I wasn't paranoid, just cautious. You never knew what kind of animals or people might be around in the woods. I had no plans to use it. I left early Monday morning and reached the turnoff by noon. It took longer than I remembered to find the old trailhead, but once I did, the nostalgia kicked in. The place looked almost the same. Trees stretching tall and thick on either side, their leaves turning orange and brown with the season, the smell of pine and damp earth filling the air. I made it to the campsite around 1:30 in the afternoon. It was a small clearing by the creek with just enough flat space for a tent and a fire pit someone had built years ago, ringed with old stones. I set up camp slowly, enjoying the quiet. No cell service, no hum of traffic, just the wind in the trees and the soft rush of the creek. I got the tent up, gathered some wood for a fire later, and ate a sandwich while sitting on a mossy log. That first day passed without anything strange. I made a fire as the sun set and sat there for hours just watching the flames. I turned in early, a little after 9, and slept surprisingly well, considering it had been years since I'd slept outside. The next day, I woke up early, around 6. The morning air was cold, and there was fog drifting through the trees. I boiled water for coffee and sat on a rock by the creek, watching the fog lift. I decided to hike around and explore. I brought my knife and water bottle and walked for hours, following old trails and animal paths. I even saw a couple of deer, and once I thought I heard a bear crashing through the trees far off. But I didn't go looking. I wasn't stupid. By the time I got back to camp, it was after 2. I cooked some beans, rested, and as the sun began to dip, I gathered more firewood. That night, I sat by the fire again, listening to the forest. I was starting to feel relaxed, like my body was letting go of the tension I'd carried for so long. It wasn't until the 3rd night that things started to feel off. I had gone to bed around 10. The fire had burned low, and I didn't bother stoking it. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag and listened to the creek for a while before drifting off. Sometime deep in the night, must have been around 2 or 3, I woke up. Something had cracked in the woods. A branch, loud, sharp. Not the kind the wind breaks, the kind that snaps when something heavy steps on it. I lay still, ears straining. For a while, I heard nothing but the normal sounds. Wind, leaves rustling. Then another snap, closer. It's hard to explain the feeling. I didn't move. I just lay there, my heart picking up speed. I told myself it was probably a deer, maybe a raccoon, but it felt wrong, like whoever or whatever it was moving slowly, on purpose. I sat up quietly, grabbed my flashlight, and waited. I didn't turn it on yet. I listened. Another crack, closer, then silence. I turned on the light and swept it across the tent walls. Nothing. I unzipped the flap a little and shined it outside. No eyes reflected the light. No movement. But I swear, I felt something watching me. I sat like that for almost 20 minutes before I closed the flap and forced myself to lie back down. I didn't sleep well the rest of the night. Every tiny noise had me wide-eyed in the dark. When the sun finally came up, I crawled out of the tent and looked around. Nothing was disturbed. No tracks. No signs of anything near the tent. I figured maybe I had just freaked myself out. Lack of sleep, too much caffeine, overthinking. That day, I stuck close to camp. I fished for a while using some line and hooks I'd packed and caught 2 small trout. I cooked them over the fire and felt a little better. Still, I didn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. That night, I set up a small perimeter, fishing line tied with a couple of tin cups as makeshift noise traps, just enough to wake me if something moved close. I went to bed around 10 again. I woke up at 3 in the morning to the sound of one of the tin cups clattering against the rocks. I froze. My flashlight was right next to my sleeping bag. I grabbed it and waited, holding my breath. I heard nothing for a long time, then the faintest crunch of leaves. Something or someone was outside the tent, moving slow. This wasn't a raccoon. I clicked on the light and unzipped the tent fast, poking my head out. Nothing, but one of the tin cups was on the ground, about 6 feet from where it had been. I stepped out of the tent and swept the light around in wide arcs. The fire had gone cold hours ago. The woods were pitch dark beyond my little clearing. Then I spotted it. A boot print, not mine, larger, heavier tread. I felt cold all over. Someone had been here. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat by the cold fire pit with my flashlight in one hand and my revolver in the other, staring into the dark. When the sun rose, I packed up fast. I wasn't going to stick around, but something caught my attention just as I was about to collapse the tent. A pile of stones near the edge of the clearing. I hadn't noticed it before. I walked over. There was something buried underneath. I could tell by the way the dirt had been turned. It wasn't recent, maybe a week or two old. I got my knife and dug a bit, just enough to see what was under there. Clothing, old, torn, and dirty. A flannel shirt and jeans, covered in what looked like dried blood. I didn't dig any deeper. I left everything but my pack and hiked out of there as fast as I could, sticking to the trail as best I could remember. I didn't stop to eat or drink, just walked and walked. The whole time I felt eyes on me. I didn't run, but I didn't stop either. I made it to my truck by early evening, threw my stuff in and drove, not stopping until I was halfway home. I pulled into a gas station and sat there for a long time, just staring at the steering wheel. I never called the police. I should have, but I didn't want to deal with it. I just wanted to forget. 3 weeks later, I looked up reports in the area. A man had gone missing hiking through that same forest. No trace was found. I read the article 3 times, thinking about that pile of rocks, that torn shirt. I haven't gone camping since. I sold all my gear. I don't go near the woods anymore. I still think about it, though. What might have happened if I'd stayed one more night? If I hadn't set those noise traps? If I hadn't woken up? I don't know who was out there, or what they were doing, but they weren't just passing through. They were hunting, and I was almost next. I was 31 when I decided to take a solo camping trip in the summer of 2017. I had a week off work, and I wanted a break from everything. City noise, people, screens, just quiet. I'd always been into hiking and the outdoors, but I had never done a full solo trip before. I figured it was time. I chose a remote area in northern Montana, just outside Glacier National Park, but far enough from the tourist trails. I didn't want marked trails or designated campsites. I wanted actual wilderness. I found a stretch of forestland that looked promising on topo maps. Miles of unbroken forest, small creeks, thick pine coverage, and no buildings or roads for at least 20 miles in any direction. It looked perfect. I packed light but smart tent, food for a week, water purification tablets, cooking gear, knife, bear spray, extra socks, first aid kit, satellite phone, paper map and compass, and a solar-powered battery pack. I left my truck at a gravel pull-off off a Forest Service road, locked it, and hiked in around noon. I planned to stay for 5 nights, moving camp every other day, always going deeper. The first 2 days were great. I found a nice clearing beside a shallow creek on the first night. I made a small fire, set up the tent, and relaxed. No cell signal, no other people. Just wind in the trees and water over rocks. On the second day, I hiked for hours and set up camp even deeper in the woods, maybe 12 or 13 miles in. Still no signs of other people, no wrappers, no footprints, no chopped wood. That was exactly what I'd wanted. But on the third morning, things started to feel off. I woke up just after dawn and immediately noticed that my pack had been unzipped. I always zip it closed and clip the flap over it. The clip was still shut, but the zipper underneath was wide open. Some things were moved around, but nothing seemed missing. I chalked it up to me being tired the night before and maybe just forgetting to close it. Still, it bugged me. I packed up camp and headed northeast. I was aiming for a spot I'd marked on my map that looked like a narrow valley between two ridgelines with a spring. I thought it would be a good place for night 3. The hike was tough, lots of climbing and thick brush, but the views were beautiful. Around early evening, I reached the valley and found the spring. It was even better than I imagined. Crystal clear water and a wide flat area surrounded by tall pines. I set up camp and had a freeze-dried meal. I tried to shake off the feeling from the morning. Maybe I was just being paranoid. It's easy to spook yourself when you're alone for that long. But before bed, I made sure everything was sealed. Food bag hung up in a tree, pack zipped and clipped, tent closed, knife beside me, bear spray in the corner of the tent. I double-checked everything. I fell asleep around 10. It was cold, maybe 40 degrees Fahrenheit, but I had a good sleeping bag. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to a sound. It wasn't loud, just the kind of noise that cuts through the silence and feels out of place. A stick breaking, but not one falling from a tree. This was quick, like someone stepped on it. I lay still and listened. My heart started to race. It wasn't windy, and I couldn't hear any animals, just stillness. And then another sound, a quiet rustling, maybe 30 feet away, toward the tree-line. It didn't sound like a deer or a bear. It sounded slow, measured, like footsteps, human footsteps. I didn't move. I just lay there listening. The sounds stopped after a few minutes. I don't know if whoever it was walked away quietly or just stood there. I didn't dare unzip the tent or turn on my flashlight. I stayed awake for hours, ears straining. Eventually, I must have dozed off. When I woke up, the sun was already up and everything looked normal. Still, I felt off. I checked around camp. No tracks that I could see, but the ground was hard. Nothing seemed moved. I took my time packing up. I considered turning back, but I hated the idea of being scared off by something I wasn't even sure was real. So I kept going. But the feeling didn't go away. On the 4th day, I hiked along the valley and up onto the ridge. It was steep and slow going, and my legs were burning. The forest was denser up there, with little sunlight breaking through. I found a decent flat area just before sundown, tucked between some boulders. It wasn't ideal, but I was tired and didn't want to keep moving in the dark. That night was worse. Around midnight, I heard something again. This time it was louder. Not just a stick, actual movement. Crunching leaves. I turned on my flashlight and sat up, shining the light toward the noise. I couldn't see much, just trees and brush. But I swear I saw something, or someone, move behind a tree. It was too fast to be sure. I sat there for a long time, light in hand, knife in the other. Eventually, everything went quiet again. I didn't sleep much after that. When the sun came up, I packed fast and got moving. I didn't eat. I didn't even refill my water at the creek. I just wanted to put miles behind me. But here's the part that really got me. About 2 miles into my hike that morning, I found something hanging from a tree branch. It was a little bundle of twigs tied together with green fishing line. It wasn't there the day before, I was sure of it. It was hanging at eye level, right in the middle of the path. Too deliberate. I stood there staring at it for a long time. I didn't touch it. I took a picture of it, then went around and kept walking. About an hour later, I noticed a cut on my right arm. Small, maybe 2 inches long. I hadn't felt it happen, and I didn't remember brushing against anything sharp. It was clean and shallow, but it weirded me out. I cleaned it with antiseptic and kept walking. Faster now. That night, I didn't make a full camp. I just kept walking into the dark until I couldn't anymore, then laid my sleeping bag under a tree and stayed curled up with my knife and bear spray. No tent. I didn't want to be trapped. I didn't light a fire. I didn't cook. I just listened. Every single sound felt like something stalking me. And this time, I know I wasn't alone. Around 3 in the morning, I heard the sound of breathing. Not close, maybe 20 or 30 feet away, but it was unmistakable. Slow, heavy breathing, then a soft grunt. Not an animal, Not a bear or a moose, something else. It lasted maybe 20 seconds. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. I waited, counting in my head, gripping the knife so tight my hand hurt. Then nothing, just silence again. When the sun came up, I was already walking. I didn't eat. I didn't stop. I just headed west, back toward the trailhead. I didn't even follow my planned path. I just moved in a straight line, climbing over rocks and pushing through brush. I didn't care about the trail anymore. I just wanted out. I reached my truck on the 5th evening. I don't even remember the last few miles. I was running on fear and adrenaline. The truck was untouched. I unlocked it, threw my gear in the back, and drove without stopping for 2 hours until I reached a town called Libby. I got a motel room and showered for almost an hour. I didn't even look at my phone until the next morning. The picture of the twig bundle was still there. I stared at it for a long time. I looked it up online. There was nothing official, just forum posts and survivalist theories. Some people said it could be a trail marker. Others said it could be a warning, stay away. A few said hunters use things like that to mark animal activity. But I knew better. That thing was meant for me. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted. But they knew I was there. They watched me. They came close. Too close. I never went back to that forest. I still camp, but only in known areas with other people nearby. I carry a bigger knife now, and I don't sleep without a motion alarm. Every time I hear a twig snap in the dark, I remember that breathing, that presence. People think the woods are peaceful, but they forget, out there anything can happen. And sometimes someone is watching. Not ghosts, not monsters, just people. And those are the scariest things of all. I've always loved camping. The quiet, the fresh air, the disconnect from the rush of everyday life. So when I had the chance to take a long weekend trip in the fall, I jumped at it. I'd heard about a place in the Rockies, a little-known area a few hours from the nearest town. People said it was peaceful, remote, and if you're lucky, you might spot wildlife up close. No crowds, no noise, just nature. I was 27, living in Denver at the time, and I'd done my share of solo camping. But this trip in late October was different. I was looking for something more, a sense of real solitude, where the only sounds would be the wind, the rustling of leaves, and the crackling of my campfire. The weather had been perfect, with clear skies and a chill in the air. I had packed light, just enough gear for a couple of nights. A tent, sleeping bag, food, water, and some basic tools. The trailhead was small, barely a sign to indicate its existence, which made it all the more appealing. I parked my old Subaru at the base and began my hike up the winding path, eager to leave the civilization behind. The trail was narrow and uneven, covered in thick patches of pine needles, which muffled my footsteps. The further I walked, the quieter it got. The usual sounds of birds and distant animals seemed to fade. It wasn't unsettling at first. I thought maybe it was just the time of year. The wind was calm, and I could smell the damp earth and fallen leaves. The air felt sharp, the kind that fills your lungs in a way that reminds you you're far from everything. After a couple of hours, the trail began to climb. The trees grew taller and denser, their branches crisscrossing overhead like an intricate web. The sun had started to dip behind the mountains, casting long shadows that stretched across the forest floor. I found a small clearing by a stream and decided this would be my campsite. It was secluded, yet had enough space for a campfire, and there was a flat area where I could set up my tent. I unpacked, setting up my tent with practiced hands, then gathered firewood. The firewood was damp, and it took longer than expected to get the fire going, but I eventually managed to get a good blaze started. As the flames flickered, I sat back against a rock, staring into the fire, watching the orange glow reflect in the darkening woods. The night was almost complete, the sky above turning deep indigo. The only sounds now were the occasional crack of a branch in the distance, the flow of the stream, and the whispering of the wind. It wasn't until the firelight flickered a bit too erratically that I started feeling something odd. Not fear, more like an unfamiliar tension. It wasn't cold yet, but I could feel my skin tingling. I told myself it was nothing. The crackling of the fire was a distraction. I looked around the clearing, half expecting to see eyes watching me from the trees, but no one was there. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being observed. I shook it off as my imagination running wild. After all, I'd spent nights alone in the wilderness before. As the evening wore on, I started cooking my dinner. It was nothing fancy, just a quick pasta meal. I ate quickly, still uneasy, not sure why. I thought about hiking back down the next morning, but something about the isolation was appealing. I had come for solitude after all. I wasn't about to let a little unease ruin my trip. I decided to go to bed early, wanting to rest up for the next day's hike. I zipped myself into the tent, laying down on my sleeping bag, trying to shake off the strange feeling. Outside, the fire had burned down to a low glow, and the quiet was absolute. I closed my eyes, drifting off into an uneasy sleep. I was 27, tired of city life, and tired of always being in a crowd. My job as a graphic designer wasn't bad, but it felt like everything around me was moving too fast and I couldn't keep up. So when I got the opportunity to rent a small cabin for a weekend in the mountains, I didn't hesitate. I wanted nothing more than peace and silence, to clear my head and reconnect with myself. It seemed like the perfect escape. The cabin was tucked away deep in the woods, about 3 hours from the nearest town. The kind of place where, if something went wrong, it might take hours before help could arrive. But I didn't think about that when I booked it. The photos online made it look cozy. Wooden walls, a fireplace, a little porch overlooking a small creek that wound through the trees. Just what I needed. When I arrived on Friday afternoon, the air smelled fresh, the kind of clean air you only get when you're far from the noise of human life. The sun was low, casting long shadows over the ground, and the only sounds were the wind rustling the trees and the occasional bird call. Everything felt still, as if the world had slowed down for me. I pulled up to the cabin, the gravel crunching under the tires. The place looked exactly like in the photos, if not a little older than it seemed in the pictures. The wood was weathered, but still solid, and the windows were large, looking out toward the creek. Perfect retreat. The door creaked as I stepped inside, and I took in the interior. Rustic, but well kept. A wood-burning stove sat at the center of the living room, and a small kitchen was tucked to one side. The furniture was simple, an old couch, a worn rug on the floor, and a single armchair by the window. The bedroom was small but comfortable, with a large bed and a dresser. Nothing fancy, but that's what I wanted, nothing fancy, just quiet. After unpacking, I decided to take a walk. The cabin was surrounded by trees, and there was a trail that led down to the creek. The ground was soft underfoot, and I could hear the babbling of the water in the distance. I followed the trail until I reached the creek, the water sparkling in the afternoon sun. I sat on a rock near the edge, watching the water flow by, my thoughts drifting with it. As the sun began to set, I headed back to the cabin. The air was cooling, and the shadows from the trees were growing longer. I lit the stove, made some tea, and sat by the window, listening to the peaceful sounds of the forest outside. There was something comforting about the stillness, the way the world seemed to hold its breath at night. I woke up late the next morning, the sun already high in the sky. I had planned on taking another walk, but something was off. The air felt heavier than it had the day before, and the trees outside the window seemed quieter. I shrugged it off. Maybe it was just the weather changing. I made breakfast and ate it slowly, savoring the solitude. The cabin felt empty in a way, but not in a bad way. It was a solitude that was peaceful, not lonely. Yet as I ate, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. It wasn't a bad feeling, just a subtle unease that lingered in the back of my mind. I decided to take a walk anyway, to distract myself. The trail leading away from the cabin wound through a dense patch of forest, and it wasn't long before I found myself deep in the woods. The trees were tall and thick, blocking out most of the light, leaving everything in a quiet gloom. I couldn't hear anything except the occasional rustle of leaves underfoot and the chirp of a distant bird. There were no other signs of life, no other hikers, no other cabins. The woods were silent. It wasn't the kind of silence you could ignore. It pressed in on you, made you aware of the stillness around you. I paused at a clearing, my breath catching in my chest. Felt like the world had just stopped. There was no breeze, no birds, nothing. I looked around, my eyes scanning the trees, but nothing moved. I swallowed hard, trying to push away the tight feeling in my chest. I couldn't explain it. Something wasn't right. I turned back toward the cabin, walking faster now, my heart picking up speed. By the time I got back, the sky had clouded over, and a chill had settled into the air. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease, but it clung to me. I decided to stay inside for the rest of the day, reading a book by the fire. It helped a little, but not much. As the day turned into evening, the shadows outside grew longer, and the wind picked up. The trees groaned, and the branches scratched against the cabin's walls like something trying to get in. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind, but the sound was unnerving. That night, I lay in bed listening to the sounds outside. The wind had turned into something more intense, howling through the trees, making the cabin creak. Every now and then, I'd hear a snap, like a branch breaking, but it didn't sound quite right. It didn't sound like wind alone. My mind started racing with thoughts I didn't want to entertain. Had someone else come up here? Was there anyone else in the area? I tried to ignore it. I tried to sleep, but the sounds outside kept pulling me awake. It felt like something was out there, something watching the cabin. My heart raced each time a new gust of wind hit the roof, and the sound of cracking branches seemed too deliberate. I pulled the blankets over my head, trying to block out the noises, but they kept creeping in. By morning, I hadn't slept a wink. I was exhausted, drained, but I didn't want to leave. The cabin was still safe, and I had nowhere to go but back to the noise of the city. I thought about packing up and leaving, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had to stay one more day. I decided to go down to the creek again. The water was cold, and the rocks slippery underfoot, but I welcomed the distraction. The sun was finally peeking through the clouds, casting golden light over the trees. The peace of the place was still there, buried beneath the tension, but it was still there. That's when I saw it. A figure, just a blur at first, standing across the creek. It was a man, dressed in dark clothing, standing perfectly still. My breath caught in my chest, and I froze, watching him. He didn't move, didn't acknowledge me in any way. He just stood there, staring into the woods. My heart thudded in my chest. I didn't know how long I stood there, just watching him. Finally, he turned and disappeared into the trees. I didn't know what to do. My first instinct was to run back to the cabin, but my legs wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, too afraid to take a step. When I finally found my feet, I rushed back to the cabin. The whole way back, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting the man to be behind me. I locked the door when I got inside, sitting in the living room with the curtains drawn, my eyes flicking to every shadow, every sound. Was he out there? Was he watching? The hours crawled by, the silence oppressive. I didn't dare leave the cabin again. Every creak of the wood, every gust of wind, made my heart race. By the time night fell, I was certain I wasn't alone anymore. But the man never came. The night passed, and I woke up the next morning with the sun streaming through the window. It was a new day, calm, almost serene, and yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that the danger wasn't over, that the quiet of the woods was just a lull before something worse happened. I packed up my things, ready to leave, ready to get back to normal life. I left the cabin behind me, driving away with the sound of the engine drowning out the eerie silence that had settled into the woods. I never saw the man again. The next few days, I tried to tell myself I had imagined it all, the figure, the feeling of being watched. But part of me knew that I hadn't. I hadn't imagined the fear. The woods had their secrets, and I was lucky to leave them behind. I was 36 when I decided to take a long break from city life. I had been working in logistics management for over a decade, and even though I wasn't old, I felt worn out in ways that didn't heal with just a weekend off or even a vacation. I lived in northern Illinois at the time, near Joliet, but I always had a thing for remote places. I grew up fishing with my dad in parts of northern Minnesota, and those memories stayed with me like warm echoes. Quiet lakes, thick forests, the crackle of firewood, and the sound of loons calling at dusk. It was peace in its purest form. In September of 2021, I took 3 months off work. I used some savings, bought a used Jeep Grand Cherokee, and rented out a cabin up near Ely, Minnesota. This wasn't a luxury setup. I found it through a local listing board, a guy named Dale who owned a patch of land with 3 scattered cabins. He rented out the farthest one on the lot, the one that backed into about 10 square miles of nothing but state forest. It had no electricity, only a wood stove for heat, and the only water came from a pump 50 yards behind the place. To most people, that sounds like hell. To me, it sounded perfect. It was the kind of place where time just didn't matter. The cabin sat right at the base of a small hill, with thick pine trees pressing in around the edges. There was a rickety old porch with a busted swing chair that groaned when you sat in it. Inside, it had one small bedroom, a kitchen area, and a main room with a wood-burning stove and a couple of old armchairs. The windows were small and set high, probably to conserve heat during the winter. It was the kind of place where you had to chop your own firewood and keep your food in a cooler to keep the animals out. I brought my dog with me, Remy, a 7-year-old German Shepherd who was more alert than most people I knew. She had a sharp mind and was loyal to the core. I'd had her since she was a pup. She never left my side, and I trusted her instincts more than I trusted my own. I figured if something didn't feel right, Remy would let me know. The first 2 weeks went by like a dream. I spent my mornings hiking or fishing in the nearby lakes. Afternoons were for reading, making simple meals, or chopping wood. Nights were quiet except for the wind or the occasional howl of wolves deeper in the forest. I even kept a journal, something I hadn't done since college. I was sleeping better, eating better, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. It was around the 3rd week that things started to shift. I was out tracking deer one morning, just for observation, not hunting, when I came across something strange. About 3 miles from the cabin, deep in the woods, I found what looked like an old trail. It wasn't marked on any of the maps I had, but it was clearly man-made. Faint tire tracks, maybe from an ATV or small off-road vehicle, ran along it. What caught my eye was how overgrown it was, like no one had used it in years, but the tracks were fresh. The leaves and pine needles had been pushed aside recently. Too recently. I followed it for about half a mile, Remy staying close and alert. Eventually, we came to a small clearing. It wasn't natural. The ground was torn up, and there were signs of old posts like someone had tried building something there. But the strangest part was the smell. Not rot, not quite. Something metallic, sour. It made my stomach twist. Remy froze, ears perked, staring into the tree line like she saw something I didn't. I stood there for a few minutes trying to shake the unease, but I couldn't. We turned around and went back to the cabin. That night, I couldn't sleep. Remy was restless too. She kept getting up, pacing near the door, then going to the window. Around midnight, I heard something outside. It was faint but real, not an animal. Slow, steady crunching in the leaves. I killed the lantern and stood there in the dark, holding my breath, listening. Remy growled low under her breath. Passed after a while, whatever it was, but I didn't sleep at all. The next day, I hiked back to that clearing. I brought a hunting knife with me, just in case. The smell was still there, and this time I noticed something I'd missed before. There were bones, small ones, scattered around the base of a tree. Not clean, not stripped by predators. Almost like they'd been cut. I know the difference. My dad was a butcher before he retired. I saw enough carcasses growing up to know what natural decomposition looks like. This wasn't that. These bones had been processed. I didn't go further. I turned back, but I didn't go back to the cabin right away. I walked south for a while, maybe 2 or 3 miles, thinking maybe I could find where the trail started or led. I didn't. It just faded out into thick brush. That night, I barricaded the cabin door with a chair and kept the axe by my bed. Remy didn't sleep at all. Over the next few days, I started hearing things at night more often. Footsteps, the crunch of brush. Once, I swore I heard a faint humming sound. Not music, not anything I could recognize. Just a low, rhythmic hum, like someone was mumbling under their breath. It faded when I got close to the window. I started going out less. I stuck close to the cabin, only taking short walks during daylight. I felt like I was being watched, constantly. Then I found the wire. It was wrapped around a tree about 20 feet behind the cabin, just above eye level. Almost invisible unless you were looking for it. A thin copper wire strung tight between two pines. I followed it about 30 yards through the brush to a small, square black box nailed into another tree. Some kind of motion detector or trail cam, but it wasn't like anything I'd seen sold commercially. No brand name. Looked custom built. I didn't touch it. I didn't want whoever put it there to know I found it. Instead, I packed up Remy and drove into town the next morning. It was about a 40-minute drive. I bought a trail camera of my own, along with a pair of binoculars and a few other supplies, extra batteries, more lantern fuel, and a pair of thermal gloves. I didn't talk to anyone about what I'd found. I didn't want them thinking I was some paranoid outsider. I set up my trail cam the next afternoon, facing the back of the cabin. I angled it low, near where I'd found the wire, but hidden well enough that it couldn't be seen unless you knew exactly where to look. That night, I didn't light a fire. I sat in the dark with Remy beside me, staring at the back window. At 2:18 a.m., I heard footsteps. Not animal, human. They moved slowly right along the tree line. Remy stood, tail stiff, ears perked. I didn't move. I just listened. Then came the sound of metal, like something scraping against the tree bark. And then, silence. In the morning, I checked the trail cam. What I saw still makes my skin crawl. There was a man, mid-40s, maybe 50, standing near the wire just outside the cabin's rear view. He was wearing camouflage gear, the kind hunters wear, but his face was uncovered. He was just standing there, staring at the cabin. His expression was completely blank. No emotion. He didn't blink for over 30 seconds in the footage. Then, slowly, he moved out of frame. I packed my bag immediately. I didn't care about the 3-month plan. I'd had enough. Something was off about that whole area, and I wasn't about to wait around to find out more. I grabbed my essentials, loaded Remy in the Jeep, and started driving. But the road out had changed. Someone had felled a tree across the trail. It hadn't been down before. I would have seen it. This was fresh. The inner bark was still yellow and wet, like it had only just been cut. I backed up, turned off the engine, and sat there for a moment. I didn't want to get out, but I didn't have a choice. I had a hand axe in the back and started clearing branches. Remy was growling, pacing behind me, never taking her eyes off the woods. Took me 2 hours to get the road clear enough to drive around. Once I did, I didn't stop. I drove straight through the night and didn't look back until I hit Duluth. A few days later, I called the county sheriff's office and told them about the wire, the camera, the man I saw. They sent someone out, or at least they said they would, but I never heard back. Dale, the property owner, never returned my calls either. I looked him up months later. Turns out he sold the land a few weeks after I left. No explanation, no forwarding contact. Just gone. I still don't know what I stumbled into up there. Illegal hunting? A poacher's camp? Some kind of backwoods surveillance operation? Maybe worse. All I know is it wasn't meant to be found, and I wasn't meant to stay. That trip changed something in me. I still love the woods, but I don't go off-grid anymore. I stick to public campgrounds, trails with signs, places where other people are always nearby. I installed security cameras around my home and got Remy professionally trained in protection work. I don't tell this story often. When I do, people either don't believe me or they suggest it was a drifter or just some hunter messing around. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. Sometimes at night, when it's real quiet, I still hear that humming sound. Low, steady, like someone mumbling in the trees. And I don't sleep. I just listen. I was 34 the summer I took the job. It was 2017, and I'd been laid off from my warehouse job in Dallas after almost a decade. My girlfriend had just left me 2 months earlier, and my savings were thinning out fast. The stress was eating at me like termites in old wood. I needed something, anything, to shake the feeling that I was circling a drain. That's when I saw the listing on a forum I usually only checked when I was bored. Some guy named Harold Livingston was looking for someone to stay in a remote mountain cabin in Colorado and maintain it for the summer. 3 months, $12,000. Free food, basic supplies, satellite internet. All I had to do was make sure the place didn't fall apart. Sweep the porch, keep the pipes from freezing at night, clear fallen trees from the driveway. Sounded like the perfect isolation gig for someone who wanted to disappear for a while. I messaged him, and after a quick phone interview, he sent me a signed agreement, GPS coordinates, a set of instructions, and a key in the mail. No background check, no questions. That should have been a red flag, but back then I was too desperate to care. I packed my Ford Explorer with clothes, canned food, a few tools, and my old dog, Marlowe. He was a 10-year-old German Shepherd mix, had some arthritis in his back legs, but he was still sharp and alert. I figured the fresh air would do him good, and I didn't want to leave him behind. He'd been with me through a lot. The drive took about 15 hours split over 2 days. I hit the small mountain towns, dirt roads, and finally a gravel path that wound through thick pine forest like a snake. The cabin sat on the edge of a narrow ridge, with forest behind it and a steep drop down to a dry ravine on the east side. From the front porch, I could see across the valley and even catch glimpses of a river far in the distance when the sun hit it right. It was beautiful in a wild, forgotten way, the kind of place that made you realize how small you really were. It wasn't huge, 1 bedroom, a bathroom with a water heater powered by a small propane tank, a main living area with a couch and wood stove, and a small kitchen. There was a shed about 30 yards away that held tools, gas cans, a backup generator, and a large freezer hooked to solar panels. There was also a chainsaw, an axe, and boxes of supplies stacked neatly inside. The first 2 weeks were peaceful. I spent the mornings chopping firewood, walking with Marlowe, or fishing in a creek about a mile downhill. At night, I'd read books from the shelves, cook simple meals, and listen to the wind outside. Felt like I'd landed in another time. No cars, no cell reception, no voices but my own. It was good. Too good, maybe. The first thing that unsettled me happened during the 3rd week. I'd woken up early, around 6 a.m., and stepped out to get some air. There was frost on the grass, even though it was late June, and Marlowe was sniffing around the side of the cabin with more purpose than usual. He trotted over to the trees, ears high, and froze. I followed, squinting into the woods. There were boot prints, not mine. I hadn't seen another person since I arrived. The nearest town, Gunnison, was over 2 hours away. These prints came from deeper in the woods and stopped about 20 feet from the back door. Then they turned around and went back the way they came. No wandering, no confusion. Someone had come right up to the cabin, stood there, and left. I looked at Marlowe. His back fur was raised, and he let out a low, rumbling growl. I stood there for a long time listening, but the woods were silent. That day, I walked the perimeter. I found more prints looping around to the side of the shed. There were no broken branches, no trash, nothing stolen or damaged. Just signs that someone had been there, watching, maybe. That night, I locked the doors and windows tight. I kept the axe next to the bed. I didn't sleep much. The days after that, I kept Marlowe closer. He was agitated, constantly pacing, ears perked toward the trees. I tried to tell myself it was an animal, maybe a hunter or a lost hiker, but the prints were fresh, regular, and too precise. Whoever it was knew where they were going. They weren't lost. On the 28th day, I checked the shed to find the chainsaw missing. It had been there the day before. Nothing else was gone. Not the fuel cans, not the tools, just the chainsaw. It didn't make sense. Why take only one thing and something so loud and obvious? I called the satellite internet number Harold had left in case of emergencies, but it rang endlessly and then disconnected. I emailed him too. No reply. I started sleeping in short shifts, keeping watch in the living room with Marlowe curled up beside me. He'd twitch and groan in his sleep, ears flicking. Sometimes he'd wake and bark at the door, even when nothing was there. Then came the noises. At first, it was knocking soft, almost playful, from the woods. Not on the door, but from the trees behind the cabin. Around midnight, always the same spot. Knock, knock, knock. 3 slow raps. I'd grab the flashlight, shine it through the window, but never saw anything.
No prints.
No movement, just trees and darkness. I stopped going far from the cabin. The next incident happened during a storm. It was mid-July by then. Wind howling, rain pelting sideways. I was reading by lantern light when I heard the generator shut off. The lights blinked and died. Then, a loud thump on the roof. Not a branch, something heavier. I froze. Marlo shot up, barking so loud it made my ears ring. I grabbed the flashlight and crept toward the door. Another thump. I aimed the light at the roof through the window. Nothing. The next morning, I found claw marks on the side of the shed. Long, deep gashes in the wood. Not from an animal. I could see where the chainsaw had been used. Someone had tried cutting into the shed from the back. But they gave up. Maybe they thought I'd be inside. Maybe they weren't ready yet. That night, I left all the lights on and slept with the axe across my chest. I'd been there 42 days when I decided to leave. It wasn't just fear. It was exhaustion. I was worn down from waiting, from trying to guess when or where they'd come next. I started packing before sunrise. Canned food, blankets, maps. I loaded the Explorer quickly, keeping the engine running. Marlo jumped in fast, tail stiff, eyes scanning the tree line. But the car wouldn't move. The back tires were flat. I jumped out and saw 4 neat slices in the rubber. Not punctures, cut straight across like someone used a blade. Both rear tires, same pattern. I checked the shed, the spare was gone. That's when I knew they didn't want me to leave. I started preparing for war. I set up tripwires using cans and fishing line around the porch and windows. I boarded up the smaller windows with planks from the shed. I nailed a long board with screws through it just inside the back door. I kept the generator off, relying only on lanterns and firelight. I ate less, slept even less. Marlo started losing weight. He wouldn't eat unless I sat beside him. His bark was weak, and his legs trembled more each day. But he still watched the woods. I didn't leave the cabin for 5 days straight. On the 6th night, the tripwire by the front steps snapped. Cans went flying. I ran to the window and saw a figure, thin, tall, wearing a dark coat, dart into the trees. Fast, too fast. The next morning, I found a message etched into the wood of the porch. "You're not alone." I broke. I sat on the floor with Marlo's head in my lap and cried. I hadn't cried in years, but the fear had built up so much it poured out. I wasn't just afraid of dying. I was afraid I'd never be found. That night, I didn't sleep at all. The next morning, I found a truck parked near the ravine. It was hidden under brush, but I saw the glint of metal in the sun. I approached slowly, axe in hand. The truck was old, early 2000s, with no plates. Inside were empty food wrappers, rope, a knife, and a Polaroid photo of the cabin. My cabin. I knew then that someone had been living in the woods, watching me, planning something. I went back and packed the essentials again: water, canned food, a gun I'd found locked in the shed with 2 bullets left, and Marlo. I wrapped his legs in cloth, strapped a pack to his back with light supplies, and at dawn we left. I didn't take the road. We hiked, down the ravine, up the other side, through brambles and gullies. I used the compass and a torn map from the cabin. I figured if I could make it 10 miles southeast, I'd hit a ranger station or a road. Took us 2 days. We slept in the open under trees. I didn't light fires. I barely spoke. I kept the gun close. Marlo limped behind me, never complaining. He was a damn soldier. On the morning of the 3rd day, we hit a dirt road. I cried again. 3 hours later, we flagged down a passing trucker hauling lumber. He took us to a sheriff's station in Gunnison. I told them everything. The break-ins, the stolen chainsaw, the slashed tires, the truck hidden in the woods. They sent officers up. They never found the man, but they found the cabin van. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I had been planning this solo camping trip for months. Something about the quiet of nature, the simplicity of just being alone with my thoughts, appealed to me. My name is Thomas, and at 29 years old, I'd gone on a few solo trips in the past, but nothing quite like this. It was late October, and the air had started to cool as the day ended. I was camping in the remote wilderness of the Rocky Mountains, just outside a small town in Colorado. There wasn't much around, just miles of untouched forest and the occasional trail. Perfect for solitude. I'd set up camp earlier that day, near a small creek. It was the kind of spot you dream about when you think of camping. Beautiful views, the sound of running water nearby, and the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze. My tent was pitched neatly, and my campfire crackled as I sat in front of it, preparing some food for the evening. I didn't have a whole lot, just a small portable stove, some dried meals, and a couple of cans of beans. As night fell, the forest seemed to grow quieter, the sounds of the birds and animals that were so present during the day fading into a soft hush. Only the crackling of the fire and the occasional splash of water from the creek broke the silence. It was peaceful, too peaceful almost, but I didn't think much of it. After finishing my meal, I decided to explore a bit, not straying too far from camp. The air was crisp, the ground damp with the remnants of the day's moisture. My boots crunched the fallen leaves beneath me as I walked along the creek, watching the water meander through the rocks. The trees around me were tall and imposing, their branches swaying in the wind. It was a scene right out of a painting, yet something about the stillness felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't as alone as I thought I was. I laughed it off at first. After all, I was in the middle of a national forest. Of course, there would be wildlife, bears, mountain lions, deer. I had read about these dangers before coming out here, but I figured I had nothing to worry about. I wasn't near any bear dens or known mountain lion habitats. Still, as I walked along the creek, I felt eyes on me. Maybe it was the sound of my footsteps amplifying in the silence, or maybe it was just my imagination running wild. Whatever it was, I couldn't shake the sensation that something was watching me. As the minutes passed, I began to feel uneasy. The forest, usually so serene, felt claustrophobic. The trees seemed taller, the darkness deeper. I turned around and made my way back to camp quickly, brushing off the creeping paranoia that was beginning to settle in. When I arrived back at my tent, the fire was still burning, but the warmth from it seemed to have dimmed somehow. I fed more wood into the flames and sat down again, hoping the fire's crackling would calm my nerves. The night was now fully upon me, and the temperature had dropped considerably. I pulled on a jacket and zipped myself into my sleeping bag, trying to ignore the chill in the air. But as I lay there, staring up at the roof of the tent, I couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. The wind outside had picked up, and the branches of the trees creaked and groaned in the gusts. Every little sound seemed amplified in the stillness of the night. Hours passed in a restless half-sleep, my mind constantly drifting between wakefulness and dreams. The wind outside howled, the tent shaking lightly with each gust. I had just started to doze off when I heard it, a faint noise just barely audible over the wind. At first, I thought it was the sound of a large animal moving through the forest. Maybe a deer, maybe a bear, but it wasn't the rustling I had expected. This was different. It was almost like the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming closer. I held my breath, straining to hear. There it was again, a soft, shuffling noise, like someone walking through the underbrush. My heart began to race, and I found myself holding my breath. I could hear the crunch of leaves, the snapping of twigs underfoot. Whoever or whatever was out there was moving slowly, purposefully, as if they were aware of my presence. The footsteps stopped just outside my tent, and for a long moment, everything was silent. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I wasn't sure what to do. The idea of going out there to check was absurd. If it was an animal, I didn't want to risk startling it. But if it was a person, that thought sent a chill through me. I had read stories about people who went missing in the wild, never to be seen again, and now, alone in the dark forest, I wondered if I might be next. The minutes dragged on, the silence deafening. I waited, barely moving, listening for any sign of activity. The footsteps, if that's what they had been, didn't come back. Maybe I had imagined them, I thought. My nerves had been shot all day, and I had probably just been hearing things. But that didn't explain the faint scraping sound I heard next. A sound like something, or someone, was dragging something heavy along the forest floor. The sound was distant, but it was there. I slowly unzipped my tent just enough to peek out, but I didn't see anything. No movement, no sign of life. I stared into the dark forest, the firelight casting long, distorted shadows on the trees. Nothing. I didn't sleep at all that night. I spent the rest of the hours listening to every crack and groan the forest made, eyes darting to every shadow, convinced something was out there. By morning, I was exhausted, my eyes heavy with lack of sleep. But as I packed up my things and prepared to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The sensation of being watched persisted, even as I made my way back to the car. When I reached the trailhead, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A set of large footprints, deep and unmistakable, led right up to the edge of the trail, just where I had camped. They weren't from an animal. They were human. I quickly got into my car and drove away, never looking back. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there, but I know one thing for sure. I'll never go back to that part of the forest again. It was late September when I decided to take that camping trip. The kind of trip that was meant to be peaceful, a chance to disconnect from everything for a few days. No phones, no distractions, just me, nature, and the simple quiet of the woods. I was 28, living in a small town in Michigan, working a desk job that had started to wear on me. I'd been to this forest before, but only on day hikes. This time, I wanted to camp. I wanted to experience the full thing. Setting up a tent, cooking over a fire, and being out there in the quiet. Maybe I needed a break more than I realized, or maybe I was just tired of the noise of everyday life. Either way, I packed my gear, got in my truck, and drove a couple of hours to a place called Big Pines National Forest. I pulled up to the parking lot at the trailhead around mid-afternoon. It was colder than I expected for September, and the trees were starting to turn, their leaves showing off a little early autumn color. I could already smell the earthy, pine-scented air that I loved so much, and for a moment, I felt at peace. The trail I was heading to was a loop that stretched about 8 miles, and the campsite was right on a small creek. It was a popular spot for people who wanted to get away but still be close enough to civilization if they needed it. I knew it wouldn't be completely isolated, but that didn't matter. I was looking for solitude, not total isolation. I started the hike around 4 p.m., trying to pace myself. The trail wasn't difficult, mostly flat, and it wasn't long before I was deep into the forest, the canopy of trees overhead blocking out most of the sun. The air was cool but not cold, and with every step, I felt more and more disconnected from the hustle and bustle of the world. This was exactly what I needed. By the time I reached the campsite around 6 p.m., the sun was beginning to dip behind the trees. The spot was perfect, an open clearing next to the creek, with a fire ring already in place and a few logs set up as benches. I dropped my backpack on the ground, relieved to have made it. I set up my tent first, securing the stakes into the damp earth, then gathered some firewood from the pile nearby. The creek babbled gently behind me, and the sound was soothing. I started the fire without much trouble, something I was familiar with from my occasional camping trips. The flames crackled and popped, and the warmth spread through the cool evening air. I took out a can of chili and heated it over the fire, the smell of food mixing with the pine scent around me. As I sat there, eating and watching the fire dance, I couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. This was exactly what I had needed. It wasn't long before the sun finally set, leaving the forest in a twilight haze. The stars began to appear one by one, slowly filling the sky with their cold, distant light. The firelight flickered, casting long shadows around the clearing. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the soft rustling of the leaves in the trees. I felt completely alone, but not in a bad way, just alone enough to be free of everything that had been weighing on my mind. As the night deepened, I started to feel that familiar sense of unease that sometimes comes with being out in the wilderness. It wasn't fear, not exactly, but more like a heightened awareness. The forest had a life of its own, and while it was beautiful, it also reminded you that you were a visitor here. This wasn't home, and the longer you stayed, the more you realized how small and fragile you were in comparison to the world around you. I tossed another log on the fire, and as the flames flared up, I thought I saw something move at the edge of the clearing. It was quick, almost too quick to register, but I definitely saw it. Just a flash of movement, like something had darted between the trees. It wasn't a bear. I knew what they looked like from past encounters. This was smaller, more like a person's shape, but moving at a pace that seemed too fast for a human. I froze, watching the spot where I thought I saw it, but nothing else moved. The shadows played tricks in the firelight, and after a minute, I convinced myself it was nothing more than the wind shifting through the branches. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was one of those instincts you can't quite explain, like the hairs on the back of your neck standing up when you feel someone watching you. I couldn't decide if it was just my imagination or something more. Maybe it was the isolation, maybe the darkness, but whatever it was, I started to feel more aware of every noise around me. The wind, the crackling fire, the occasional snap of a branch. Even the sound of the creek seemed louder now. I finished my dinner quickly and decided to turn in early. The night had a strange energy to it, and I figured a good night's sleep would help clear my head. I slipped into my tent, rolled out my sleeping bag, and settled in, leaving the fire to burn out on its own. The air inside the tent was cool but not uncomfortable, and soon enough, I drifted off to sleep. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but the first thing I noticed was the silence. The usual forest noises had stopped. No rustling leaves, no wind, nothing. I lay still, listening, but all I could hear was my own breath. It was the kind of silence that made everything feel too quiet. Then I heard it, a soft crunch of footsteps on the ground outside the tent. My heart skipped a beat, and I held my breath, straining to hear more. It wasn't the noise of an animal like a deer or a raccoon. It was too deliberate, too controlled. I wasn't sure what to do. Should I call out? Should I confront whoever was out there? I didn't know if it was a person, but the possibility made my skin crawl. I reached for my flashlight, careful not to make any noise, and switched it on. The beam of light flickered in the dark, casting shadows inside the tent. Another crunch, this time closer. I froze, holding my breath again, trying to listen. The footsteps stopped, and for what felt like an eternity, everything was still. Too still. I couldn't move. I didn't know if I was being watched or if I was just overthinking it, but every instinct I had told me that something wasn't right. Then, just as I was about to convince myself it was nothing, I heard a voice. It was faint, muffled by the fabric of the tent, but it sounded like it was coming from the other side. I held my breath again. The voice sounded strange, almost like it was whispering, but not to me. It wasn't a normal whisper, though. It felt off, like it was trying to stay hidden. The voice faded away, and the footsteps started again. This time retreating, moving further back into the woods. My pulse was racing now. Whoever or whatever had been out there was leaving, but the dread didn't leave with it. I waited in silence for what felt like hours, but nothing else happened. Slowly, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, shining the flashlight around. The clearing was empty. The fire had burned down to embers, and everything was still. Too still. I checked my gear, checked the perimeter, but I couldn't find anything. No signs of anyone or anything having been there, just the normal sounds of the forest slowly creeping back in. I didn't know what had happened, but whatever it was gone. I stayed up the rest of the night, too unsettled to sleep, keeping the fire going and the flashlight close. When morning finally came, I packed up my things quickly. The sun was up, the forest was quiet again, and I felt a strange mix of relief and confusion. I had no idea who or what had been out there, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't coming back here again. I hiked out of the woods as quickly as I could, my heart still racing. I didn't look back, and I didn't stop until I reached my truck. I drove away without a second thought, the woods now a memory I'd never shake. My name's Adam, and this happened in the summer of 2017. I was 29 at the time, living in Spokane, Washington, working as a freelance graphic designer. Work had been slow that month, and I needed to clear my head. I figured a solo camping trip would be a good way to reset. I'd done it before, driving out, hiking into the forest, finding a remote spot to set up camp for a few nights. No cell signal, no internet, just me and nature. That's what I wanted. I picked a spot near the Kaniksu National Forest, close to the Idaho border. It was a place I'd been to once with a group of friends years ago, but this time, I planned to hike deeper into the woods, somewhere off-trail where I'd have total solitude. I packed everything I needed: a lightweight tent, a sleeping bag, a hatchet, a propane burner, a knife, freeze-dried meals, plenty of water, my old .22 rifle for safety, and my backpacking gear. I also brought a notebook and a book I had been meaning to finish. I didn't tell many people where I was going, just left a note on the fridge for my roommate in case something happened. I drove out early on a Tuesday morning, parked near a dirt access road around noon, and started hiking in. It was about 85 degrees, clear sky, and no wind. I found a stream after about 5 miles, and the spot looked perfect. Pine trees everywhere, soft moss underfoot, and no signs of human activity. I pitched my tent on a flat patch of ground about 50 yards from the stream and took my time setting everything up. I made a small fire ring, boiled some water for a meal, and settled in. That first night was peaceful. I laid in my tent with the flap open, watching the stars through the trees. The only sounds were crickets and the occasional rustle of something small in the underbrush. I slept pretty well, considering I was on the ground. The second day, I woke up with the sun and took a short hike upstream, just exploring. I didn't bring my phone, it wouldn't work out here anyway, but I had a compass and marked a few trees so I wouldn't get lost. I found an old, toppled pine with a huge tangle of roots exposed and sat there for a while, listening. It was quiet, almost too quiet. No birds, no bugs, no wind. I figured maybe it was the time of day. I made my way back to camp around noon and started prepping lunch. Later that afternoon, I thought I heard someone yelling in the distance. It was faint, just a sharp sound like a scream or a shout. I paused and listened, but it didn't repeat. I thought maybe it was an animal, or maybe I was just hearing things. I brushed it off, but that night something felt off. Couldn't sleep. I kept hearing movement out in the woods, like twigs snapping. Could have been deer or raccoons, but it sounded slower, more deliberate. I held my rifle close and told myself it was just the forest playing tricks on me. Around 2 a.m., I heard a loud, quick snap, like a branch breaking underfoot, close by. My heart jumped. I sat up and held my breath. Then it got quiet again. I didn't go back to sleep after that. The next morning, I found something weird. About 10 feet from my tent on a tree trunk, there was a long scratch. Not a normal one, this was clean, about 4 feet high and fresh. I touched it. The bark was stripped away. I looked around, but didn't see anything else. Maybe a bear? But I didn't see any tracks or droppings, and the scratch was too straight, too smooth. I spent most of that day on edge. I didn't go exploring. I stayed near camp, cleaned my gear, and double-checked everything. I kept my rifle loaded and nearby. Around 4 p.m., it got quiet again, like the day before. No wind, no birds, just a thick, heavy silence. I had a bad feeling I couldn't shake. I boiled some water, ate dinner early, and decided to pack up the fire and call it a night before sunset. Around midnight, I woke up to a noise, something dragging against my tent. It was slow, steady, and right next to my head. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I could hear it scraping like a stick or maybe a finger running along the nylon. I held my rifle close and waited. After a minute or two, it stopped. I didn't sleep after that. I just sat there in the dark, staring at the walls of my tent, every little sound making my heart pound. At dawn, I unzipped the tent and stepped out. Nothing looked out of place except for one thing: a small pile of rocks stacked neatly about 10 feet from my tent. I hadn't made that. They weren't there the night before. It was 5 flat stones, stacked vertically, like a totem. Felt like a message, a warning. That was it. I decided to leave. I packed up quickly, kept my rifle in hand, and started heading back toward where I had parked. I moved fast, only stopping to drink water once or twice. About 2 hours in, I saw something that made my stomach sink. Another stack of rocks, just like the one near my tent. This time, it was right in the middle of the trail I was following back. I hadn't gone in a straight line, so there's no way it was the same pile. Now I was panicking. I pushed on, moving faster, trying not to trip over roots or rocks. My head was on a swivel. I kept feeling like I was being watched. I didn't see anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling. Then I found the deer. It was lying about 15 feet off the trail. Its throat was cut, not torn. A clean slice, no blood around it, which made no sense. Its eyes were still open. It didn't look like it had been dead long. The worst part? Another pile of rocks was placed right next to its head. I nearly threw up. I ran, full speed. I didn't stop until I hit the dirt road where my car was parked. I was sweating, shaking, and my chest hurt from the adrenaline. I tossed my gear in the back, locked the doors, and drove. I didn't stop until I hit a gas station about 30 miles out. I used the bathroom, washed my face, and tried to calm down. I didn't tell the clerk anything. I just bought some snacks and left. When I got home, I didn't sleep for almost 2 days. I kept the lights on, locked every door, and jumped at every sound. A week later, I went to clean out my backpack and found something inside that made my blood run cold. Tucked into a side pouch was a rock, flat, smooth, and the same kind that had been in those stacks. I didn't put it there. That was 8 years ago. I haven't gone camping alone since. I don't know who or what was out there, but it wasn't an animal. It wasn't random. Someone was in those woods with me. Someone who didn't want me there. I was being watched, followed, maybe even hunted. I never reported it. What could I say? That rocks showed up by themselves? That a deer had its throat cut in the middle of the forest? I still think about it. Every time I walk through the woods, I look for those stacked rocks. I haven't seen any since. But sometimes, I still wake up at night, heart pounding, thinking I hear something dragging against the side of my house. I don't camp anymore. I don't hike alone. And I never ignore that feeling in my gut again. I was 29 when I went on that camping trip in late October of 2018. I still think about it more than I want to. I try not to talk about it much. The people I told either don't believe me or say I was just scared and paranoid. But I know what I saw, and more importantly, I know what I felt. I grew up hiking. My dad was one of those serious outdoorsmen, maps, compass, knot tying lessons, the whole deal. He raised me on it, and I learned to love being out in the woods. Camping was always something that brought me peace. So that fall, when things in my life were getting loud and fast, work stress, breakup, rent going up, I decided to take a weekend to just disappear into the quiet. I picked a lesser-known spot in Tennessee, about 2 hours outside of Nashville. It was called Kettle Ridge Forest Reserve. Not a state park, just a stretch of protected land with a few barely used trails. I found it online through a forum for off-the-grid hiking and looked it up on Google Maps. There weren't even official campsites, which I liked. No other campers, just trees and hills and whatever I brought in with me. I packed light but smart: sleeping bag, tent, food for 3 days, water, a small filter, tools, a flashlight, extra batteries, a flare gun, and my phone with 2 battery packs. No cell signal, but I brought it for the GPS. I didn't tell many people where I was going, just one coworker, Sarah. I gave her the area and said if she didn't hear from me by Monday, call someone. That was my safety net. The first day was normal. I got to the makeshift parking area near the old forestry gate around 10:30 a.m. The hike into the woods was a little rough. Uneven trail, fallen trees, thick underbrush. It had rained earlier that week, so the ground was still damp, and my boots sank in the mud a few times. But it was quiet, and I liked that. No cars, no people. Just wind through the trees and the occasional squirrel. I hiked about 4 miles in before I found a decent spot. A flat patch on a hill with a view of the ridge and a shallow stream below. I pitched my tent, unpacked, and set up a small fire ring with some stones. I didn't plan to make a huge fire, just enough for warmth and cooking. That evening, I boiled some rice and beans, drank tea, and sat in my camp chair as the sun set. Everything felt calm until around 2 a.m. I had just started drifting off in my sleeping bag when I heard something crunch outside. Not wind, not leaves falling. Something heavy, something stepping. I froze. I lay there completely still, holding my breath. I listened harder. One step, then another. Slow, steady, deliberate. Deer, I thought, or maybe a bear. But bears don't usually walk that quietly. I reached for my flashlight without turning it on and just held it. I didn't unzip the tent or make a sound. The steps kept coming closer, then stopped. Right outside. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, everything looked normal. I got out and checked around the tent. No clear tracks, the ground was still too wet, and the leaves covered most of it. Nothing was moved or missing. Still, I felt off. That whole day, I kept looking over my shoulder while I hiked around to explore. I followed the stream down to a patch of rocks and filtered some water. Ate lunch. Climbed a ridge to get a better view of the area. That's when I saw it. A small clearing deeper into the woods, maybe half a mile east of my camp. It didn't look natural. Trees don't just grow in perfect circles like that, and the way the grass was matted down in the middle, it looked used. I wasn't sure what for, but I knew I didn't like it. I had this crawling feeling in my stomach. Still, curiosity pushed me toward it. I went back to camp, dropped off my pack, and walked to the clearing with just my knife and flashlight. The woods were thicker on that side. More thorns, more dead branches. I had to fight through some of it just to get there. When I reached the clearing, the silence hit me harder than I expected. No wind.
No birds.
Not even bugs. Just quiet, and the crunch of my boots on dead leaves. In the center of the clearing, there was an old fire pit, blackened stones and some half-burnt wood. Around it were things, weird things, a broken folding chair, a torn piece of blue tarp, a rusted coffee can, and near the edge of the clearing, a tree with something nailed to it. Piece of wood, like a sign but blank. The place smelled faintly like old smoke and mold. I backed away and didn't go back. That night was worse. I built a bigger fire and kept it going longer, hoping that maybe animals or whatever would stay away. I sat in my chair with my flashlight across my lap and watched the trees. Around 11, I started to hear something again. It wasn't footsteps this time. It was like branches snapping in the distance. Not just one or two. Repeated. Slow. Like someone walking through thick brush. But not toward me. Just moving nearby. I turned off my headlamp and sat in the dark, waiting. The snapping went on for maybe 10 minutes, then stopped. I couldn't tell where it came from exactly, just that it was close enough to hear but far enough that I couldn't see anything. I stayed up until 3 a.m. again, then finally passed out from exhaustion. In the morning, I found something new. At the back of my camp, maybe 20 feet from my tent, there was a small pile of rocks, neatly stacked, maybe 8 or 9 of them. I hadn't put them there. I didn't build it. I don't even remember seeing those rocks before. It wasn't natural either. The rocks were too round and clean. It looked placed, like someone built it on purpose. That was it. I decided to leave. I packed everything up quickly and started hiking out by 9 a.m. My legs were sore from barely sleeping, and my brain was spinning with possibilities. Was someone messing with me? Was it some weird backwoods camper or hunter? I didn't want to find out, but the hike out wasn't smooth. About 2 miles in, I realized the trail looked different. I had marked trees with a blade on my way in, just little notches to follow out, but the marks were gone. At first, I thought I missed them, so I backtracked a bit, but they weren't there. I went another half mile, and that's when I noticed a second pile of rocks off the trail. Same size, same shape, and it was fresh. Damp leaves underneath it, like it had just been built. Now I was panicking. I tried using my GPS, but the app wouldn't load. No signal. The compass still worked, so I used that to guess my way west, toward the parking area. I moved fast, didn't stop for water. I just wanted to get out. I hiked for maybe 4 hours, but the woods kept repeating. Same thick brush, Same fallen logs. I saw a tree with a large, smooth gash in the bark, and 30 minutes later, I saw it again. Same exact cut. I was looping without knowing it. Around 3 p.m., I saw smoke. It was faint, but rising between the trees maybe 200 yards away. I thought it might be another camper or maybe even a ranger station, so I moved toward it. But it wasn't a campsite. It was the clearing. Same exact one. Same broken chair. Same nailed wood. The fire pit was burning again. I swear on my life, I hadn't gone in a circle that big. There's no way I should have been back there. I never turned around. I just kept walking west. That fire wasn't lit earlier. Someone had been there. Recently. Maybe still there. I didn't go in. I turned and ran. For the next hour, I didn't think. I just moved. I ran, walked, tripped, and pushed through branches. My legs were cut up, my hands bleeding, and my chest tight. I finally hit the stream again, the one near my original camp. That's when I realized I had gone backwards. I was sweating, cold, and shaking. I followed the stream downstream, praying it would lead me back toward the parking area eventually. That's when I saw something that made me stop cold. A man's jacket, hanging from a tree branch, faded orange, dirty, and below it the remains of a small camp. Just scraps, shredded tent fabric, a metal mug, bones, animal bones, I hoped. But I didn't check. I kept moving. By some miracle, I made it back to the parking area right before dark. My car was untouched. I got in, locked the doors, and didn't stop driving until I hit a gas station an hour away. I looked back once before I left. Just once. I thought I saw someone standing in the trees at the edge of the lot. Too far to see clearly. Could have been a branch. Could have been nothing. But I didn't go back to check. I filed a report a week later with the local sheriff's office. I didn't mention everything. Just the signs of someone in the woods, the bones, and the fact that I got lost off trail. The deputy I spoke to said people get turned around in those woods all the time. Old logging trails can confuse folks, he said. They never found that clearing. They never found the rocks. They never found the fire pit. Or maybe they didn't look hard enough. I haven't camped since then. I still hike sometimes on marked trails close to towns. But I always leave before dark. And I never go alone. Because I know what it feels like when you're not alone in the woods. And I never want to feel that again. My name's Trevor Doyle, and in the summer of 2019, I made the worst mistake of my life. I was 34 back then. I'd been living in Knoxville, Tennessee, working a desk job at a logistics company. The work wasn't bad, but after nearly 10 years in that same office, I was beginning to feel like my life was slowly turning into copy paper and coffee cups. I had this itch in my chest that I couldn't scratch. A feeling like something important was slipping away, like I'd blink and wake up at 60 with a gut full of regret. That's when I decided I needed a break. I had a decent bit of vacation time saved up, and I figured the best way to reset was to get outside. Just me, a backpack, and nature. I'd done some hiking and camping growing up, mostly with my dad in the Smokies, but nothing too intense. Still, I figured I could handle myself. I planned a 4-day solo camping trip along the less traveled stretches of the Cherokee National Forest, near the border of Tennessee and North Carolina. I spent weeks mapping out my route, buying gear, checking weather forecasts. I wasn't going off the grid completely, but I wanted real solitude. No crowds, no other hikers, just trees, dirt, and silence. I picked an area east of Tellico Plains, past a place called Indian Boundary. It was supposed to be quiet and remote, with dozens of old logging trails crisscrossing through the woods. A buddy of mine, an ex-Marine who knew the area, gave me some GPS coordinates to check out. He said there were these old fire roads out there, barely visible now, but perfect for getting off the main paths. I marked them down. I left on a Thursday morning in early August. Weather was hot, mid-80s during the day, dropping to the 60s at night. I had a 60-liter pack with food, water, a tent, stove, first aid kit, and a satellite beacon just in case things went south. I didn't plan on needing it, but it made me feel better. Day 1 was uneventful. I parked my car near a forestry service gate and hiked about 7 miles in before making camp beside a small creek. The bugs were bad, but the sound of running water made up for it. I cooked some rice and tuna, set up my tent, and watched the trees turn dark as the sun dropped below the hills. I slept well that night. On the second day, I followed a narrow, overgrown trail up through a ridge. It wasn't on any official maps, but it had a faint old marker nailed to a tree. Looked like a rusted U.S. Forest Service tag. I figured it was one of the old fire breaks my friend mentioned. It wasn't easy walking. The trail was littered with branches, thorn bushes, and rocks, and the slope was steeper than I expected. By noon, I was sweating through my shirt and swatting at flies like crazy. I stopped to rest on a flat section of the trail. There was an old tree stump there, hollowed out in the middle, probably from lightning or rot. I remember thinking it looked like something out of a horror movie, but I laughed it off. I took a long drink from my Nalgene and kept walking. About 4 hours later, the trail completely disappeared. It just ended. 1 second I was pushing through weeds and shrubs. The next I was standing in a thicket of saplings with no clear path ahead. I tried circling around, looking for signs of worn ground or broken branches, but it was useless. The trail had either faded with time or I'd taken a wrong turn somewhere. I wasn't panicked, not yet. I had my GPS unit and I could always backtrack. So I pulled it out, flipped it on, and waited. Nothing. The screen stayed frozen on the boot-up screen. I restarted it twice, changed the batteries, tried everything. Still nothing. That's when my stomach dropped a little. I didn't like relying on electronics, but I'd made the mistake of letting the GPS do most of the route tracking. I hadn't paid close attention to land features or compass bearings. And now I was at least 10 miles from the car, deep in the woods with no clear trail and a busted GPS. I sat down and ate a granola bar, trying to stay calm. I figured I'd retrace my steps. I'd just follow the ridge back down, find the creek from the first night, and go from there. I started back the way I came, or at least I thought I did. But the further I went, the less things looked familiar. The light was starting to fade through the trees, and everything took on that eerie blue glow that makes shadows look like people. After maybe an hour of walking, I saw something up ahead, a plastic bag caught on a branch. I recognized it immediately. It was the one I'd used to pack out trash from the night before. That meant I just walked in a big damn circle. Now I was scared. I didn't want to hike in the dark, so I set up camp where I stood. I found a small clearing, pitched the tent, and boiled some water for soup. I kept hearing noises in the brush around me. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling, but I told myself it was just deer or raccoons. My mind was playing tricks. That night was rough. Couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd hear something. Something too quiet to be an animal. More like movement. Slow. Careful. Once I thought I heard breathing outside the tent. I held my breath for so long I got dizzy, but the noise faded. I didn't sleep more than 2 hours. In the morning, I packed up fast and started walking. I used the position of the sun to try heading west, where I knew the highway was, but the terrain was awful.
No trails.
Just thick brush, fallen logs, steep gullies. My arms and legs got shredded by thorns. My ankles ached from uneven ground. I fell at least 3 times, hard. Around noon, I stopped to check my map, which at this point felt almost useless. As I sat there, swatting flies and sweating through my clothes, I heard something behind me, a soft crunch. I spun around, heart pounding. Nothing, just woods. But something had moved. I was sure of it. I picked up my pace after that. I was burning through water faster than expected, and my food supply wasn't built for this kind of detour. I only packed for 4 days, assuming I'd be back by Sunday. At some point in the late afternoon, I found something odd. An old hunting blind, rotted and half collapsed, about 6 feet off the ground in a dead tree. It looked ancient. I climbed up just to see if I could get a better view, maybe spot a road or a power line. What I saw instead made my blood turn cold. Far down the ridge, maybe 300 yards, was a small blue tarp, and next to it something else, a shape. I couldn't tell what it was at first, but it wasn't a rock. It was too smooth. I pulled out the monocular from my belt pouch and looked again. It was a backpack, and it wasn't mine. I stared at it for a long time, wondering if someone else had gotten lost out here too. Maybe they'd set up camp and bailed. Or maybe they were still here. I decided to go check it out. It took me nearly 45 minutes to get down there through the mess of brush and broken trees. When I finally reached the tarp, my heart was thudding so hard I could feel it in my ears. The tarp was spread over a patch of mossy ground. Underneath it were empty food wrappers, a rusted cooking pot, and the backpack, which was open and half full of gear. Most of it was moldy or water damaged. But the really strange part was how old everything looked. The wrappers were for brands I hadn't seen since the early 2000s. The pot had a faded price sticker in a style I hadn't seen in years. And then I found the ID. It was in a Ziploc bag tucked into a side pocket. Tennessee driver's license. Name Michael S. Whitmore. Age 27. Expired in 2005. I sat there for a long time, staring at that ID. I remembered hearing that name before. I didn't know him, but I vaguely remembered something about a guy who went missing near here years ago. Hiker. Never found. I didn't know what to do. I didn't see any bones or remains, just the old gear. But it was clear he'd never made it out. Something had gone wrong. That night, I didn't camp. I kept walking. I didn't care about blisters or falling. I just kept going, pushing west, heart pounding every time a twig snapped or the wind moved wrong. I walked until my legs buckled and I collapsed against a tree. I dozed off there, sitting upright, jerking awake every 20 minutes. The next morning, I found a dirt road. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but no, it was real. An actual road. Narrow, overgrown, probably not used in years. But a road. I followed it for nearly 5 hours before I saw signs of life. A mailbox, a fence, then a trailer, sitting on cinder blocks, with a rusted pickup in the yard. No one was home, but the truck had a CB radio. I used it to call for help. 2 hours later, a forest ranger showed up. He looked at me like I was a ghost. They took me back to the ranger station, fed me and patched me up. I told them everything, including where I'd found the gear. They sent out a team a few days later and confirmed it, Michael Whitmore, officially missing for 14 years. They never found his remains. I don't know what happened to him. Maybe he fell, broke a leg, starved. Maybe he just got lost like me, but wasn't lucky enough to find a road. I haven't gone camping since. I still have the boots I wore out there. They sit in my garage, covered in mud I never washed off. Sometimes I still... It was early November when I decided to take some time away from everything. My life back home was chaotic, with too many things pulling me in different directions. I needed silence. I needed space. So when I found an old, secluded cabin online, deep in the woods of the Appalachian Mountains, I thought it would be the perfect escape. The cabin was isolated, surrounded by miles of trees, and far from any towns or other people. The ad said it was rustic but comfortable, and that was good enough for me. I booked the place immediately and packed up my things. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I didn't want to be bothered. The drive up was long. The further I went, the more the road twisted and turned, becoming narrow and overgrown with wild grass. I didn't mind. Part of the allure of the place was its remoteness. By the time I arrived, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the dense forest that surrounded the cabin. I pulled my car up to the small clearing in front of the cabin, taking a moment to survey the area. The cabin was small but looked sturdy. The wood was weathered, darkened by years of exposure to the elements. There was a stone chimney, and smoke drifted lazily out of it, suggesting that the fireplace inside was already in use. I assumed the owner had prepared it for my arrival. I grabbed my bag and walked to the front door, which creaked when I opened it. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood and earth, a scent that was strangely comforting. The interior was simple, just a few old chairs, a small dining table, and a fireplace. A few lanterns hung on the walls, their flames flickering in the dim light. The back wall had a large window that looked out onto the forest. The view was breathtaking, with the trees stretching as far as the eye could see. I set my bag down on the bed in the small bedroom and wandered around the cabin, taking in the rustic charm. The floor creaked under my feet, and the walls had small gaps where the wood had shifted over time. It wasn't perfect, but it was quiet. That was all I needed. I spent the evening inside, reading a book I had brought along and relaxing by the fire. The warmth of the flames was soothing, and the silence of the cabin was almost overwhelming. The wind howled outside, but inside, there was only the sound of the crackling fire. I felt at peace, but as the night wore on, something began to unsettle me. It wasn't anything specific, just an odd feeling, like I was being watched. I tried to shake it off, attributing it to the isolation, the darkness outside, and the unfamiliar surroundings. But no matter how much I tried to ignore it, the feeling persisted. I decided to go to bed, hoping that sleep would erase the discomfort I felt. But as I lay there in the quiet darkness, something strange happened. The wind outside seemed to pick up, and I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Soft at first, then louder, closer. I held my breath, straining to hear, but there was nothing. No more footsteps, just the wind. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, a deer or maybe a raccoon. There were plenty of creatures in the woods, and I had read that they often wandered near human dwellings. But the footsteps had sounded too deliberate, too human. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread in my chest. Every time the wind howled, I thought I heard something else. Footsteps, the faint scraping of something against the cabin, the soft rustling of leaves just outside the window. I didn't know how much time passed, but I finally fell into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, I woke up to an eerie stillness. The sun had risen, casting light across the cabin, but there was no sound. The wind had died down completely. I stepped out of bed and walked to the window, looking out onto the quiet woods. There was nothing unusual, no signs of movement, yet the feeling of unease didn't go away. Something about the forest seemed wrong. I spent the morning exploring the area around the cabin. The forest was beautiful, but it felt oddly oppressive. The trees were dense, the underbrush thick with brambles and fallen leaves. I wandered for a while, trying to shake off the feeling that I was being followed. But every time I turned a corner or glanced over my shoulder, I couldn't help but feel that there was something or someone out there, watching. I returned to the cabin for lunch, feeling uneasy but trying to convince myself it was all in my head. I had rented this cabin for some peace, and I wasn't going to let my imagination ruin it. But when I entered the cabin, I noticed something strange. The door was slightly ajar. I was sure I had closed it tightly when I left. I walked over and checked the latch. It was fine, but something about the way the door was open made my heart race. I shook it off. It was probably the wind, I thought. Maybe the latch wasn't as secure as I thought. But as the day went on, more things started to feel off. The food I had left out on the counter seemed disturbed, as if someone had touched it. The chairs were slightly moved, and there was a faint smell of smoke in the air, even though the fire had been out for hours. I locked all the doors and windows that night, not taking any chances. But the same feeling of being watched returned. The footsteps, the scraping, the rustling outside the window. I tried to ignore it, but it was hard. I lay in bed, listening to the sounds of the forest around me, but there was something else, something closer. The next morning, I decided to leave. I packed up my things quickly, my hands trembling as I threw clothes into my bag. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I couldn't stay another night. I had been alone for 2 days, but now the thought of being there any longer made my skin crawl. I started the car, but it wouldn't start. I tried again. Nothing. My stomach dropped. I grabbed my phone to call for help, but there was no signal. Of course, I was in the middle of nowhere. My mind raced as I tried to think of a solution. The road to the cabin was narrow and winding, and there was no sign of any nearby houses or civilization. I was stuck. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't just sit there and wait. I took a deep breath and grabbed my bag. I would have to walk out. It wasn't ideal, but it was my only option. I locked the cabin behind me and started down the overgrown road, hoping to find some sign of life. The walk felt endless. The trees pressed in around me, blocking out the sun and casting long shadows across the path. I walked for what felt like hours, but there was nothing, no sign of another soul. Just as I was starting to lose hope, I saw something up ahead, a small cabin, like the one I had stayed in. I quickened my pace, thinking that maybe I had found help. But as I got closer, I realized it was abandoned. The windows were broken, the door hanging off its hinges. It had been empty for years. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that I was walking deeper into danger. I turned around, hoping to head back to my car. But as I looked down the path, I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. A figure, a man, standing in the woods, watching me. I froze. My heart hammered in my chest as I tried to process what I was seeing. The man didn't move. He just stood there, his face obscured by the shadows of the trees. I couldn't make out any details, but I knew he was watching me. I didn't wait to find out what he wanted. I turned and ran. I ran until my legs ached, until my breath came in ragged gasps. The woods were a blur around me, and I could hear the crunch of leaves under my feet, but all I could focus on was getting away. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw the clearing where my car was parked. I didn't stop. I reached the car and tried the ignition again. This time, the engine turned over, and the car roared to life. I didn't hesitate. I slammed the car into gear and sped down the road, leaving the cabin and whatever else was in those woods behind. As I drove, I felt the tension in my chest slowly begin to ease. I couldn't explain what had happened at that cabin, but I didn't need to. I wasn't going back. I knew that for sure. It wasn't until I was a few hours away that I realized I hadn't locked the cabin when I left. The door had been left ajar, and that wasn't the only thing. The thought of the man in the woods lingered in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he hadn't been the only one watching. I never found out who or what had been out there, but one thing was clear: I would never return to that cabin. Some things are better left unexplored. It was the middle of autumn when I decided to get away from the noise of the city. I was 27, feeling the weight of a few too many late nights at work, too many stressful deadlines, and too many evenings spent surrounded by people I barely knew. I needed quiet. I needed solitude. So, when I stumbled upon an ad online for a small cabin in the woods, tucked away near a lake about 2 hours from where I lived, I booked it. No second thoughts, no hesitation. The cabin was an old one, built somewhere in the late 70s, according to the owner. He seemed like the type who didn't really care much for modern amenities or technology, and I was okay with that. I wanted the disconnection, the peace, and the raw simplicity of nature. I wanted to be cut off. I packed only the basics: clothes, food, some books, and a few things to make the cabin more comfortable. The car ride out there was pleasant enough, though the roads grew more uneven as I drove farther from the nearest town. The deeper I got into the woods, the more I felt the weight of isolation settle over me. When I finally arrived, the sun was starting to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows over the cabin. It was smaller than I had imagined, but it had character. The wooden beams were worn and weathered by time, but the place felt solid. There were no neighbors, no signs of civilization, just trees, dirt roads, and the constant murmur of the nearby lake. The only thing that could be heard was the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. I unloaded my car, carried my bags inside, and immediately began setting up. The cabin had an old stove, a few mismatched chairs, a small fireplace, and a single bedroom with a bed that creaked whenever you moved. The walls were lined with shelves full of old books, some of which I planned to read. I could already feel the stress of the city beginning to fade. The first night was uneventful. I cooked a simple dinner over the stove, set up a fire, and settled in with a book. I didn't feel scared, not even a little. The solitude was peaceful. I went to bed early, wrapped up in the warmth of the blankets, listening to the sounds of the woods outside. But then, on the second night, things started to change. It was about midnight when I was awoken by a noise. I wasn't sure what it was at first. A creak? A knock? My mind raced through the possibilities. Branches brushing against the cabin, the wind howling, or maybe just the house settling. I tried to ignore it, turning over and pulling the blanket tighter around me. But the noise came again, louder this time. A thud, a scraping sound. My heart rate quickened, and I couldn't dismiss it. Something wasn't right. I got out of bed, careful not to make too much noise. The cabin was dark, with only the faint glow of the dying embers in the fireplace. I grabbed a flashlight and moved to the window. Outside, it was pitch black, except for the occasional flicker of moonlight through the trees. I couldn't see anything moving, nothing that would explain the sound. But the air felt different, heavier, colder, almost oppressive. I told myself it was just my imagination running wild. The woods were strange, after all, and the isolation played tricks on your mind. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I spent the next hour checking the locks on all the windows and doors, double-checking that everything was in place. It was fine, I told myself. It had to be. After all, I was alone in a cabin, miles away from anyone. There was no reason to be afraid, but I couldn't get back to sleep. Every noise outside, every rustle of leaves, made my muscles tense. I lay there, listening to the stillness of the night, hoping for it to pass. The following morning, I woke up exhausted, but I decided to ignore the unease I felt. I made some coffee and spent the day outside, walking by the lake, breathing in the fresh air, and trying to clear my head. The weather was chilly, but the sun was out, and the autumn colors were in full swing. It was beautiful, but there was something unsettling about the silence. Even though there were birds, insects, and the occasional animal moving through the trees, it felt as if the forest was holding its breath. It was too quiet. No distant hum of traffic, no sounds of people. Just me and the endless stretch of trees. That evening, as I was preparing dinner, I heard the noise again. This time it was closer, coming from the back of the cabin. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the trees. This was something more deliberate, something human. I froze, my hands stilling over the stove. My heart skipped a beat. I set the spatula down slowly, then crept to the back window, the one that faced the forest. Nothing. No one. I checked the back door, locked. All the windows were shut, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there. Someone watching me. By the third night, the sense of unease had grown to a palpable fear. I hadn't heard anything during the day, but every time the wind picked up, I felt like I was being surrounded. I locked every door and window again, but this time, I didn't feel safe. Every creak of the wood, every distant thud made my skin crawl. I made the decision to leave. It wasn't worth staying in a place that made me feel like this. But as I began packing my things, I noticed something strange. My car keys were missing. I searched the cabin from top to bottom, going through every drawer, every shelf, even checking the fireplace, but the keys were gone. There was no way I could have misplaced them. I hadn't even taken them out of my pocket since I arrived. At this point, panic started setting in. I checked my phone, but there was no service, no bars, no connection to the outside world. That's when I heard it again, this time unmistakable. A heavy knock at the front door. I stood frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. Someone was definitely out there. I didn't know what to do. There was no way I was opening the door, not with whatever or whoever was on the other side. I grabbed the axe from the corner by the fireplace, the only tool that could offer any kind of protection, and waited. Minutes passed, but nothing happened. The knock didn't come again. The air was still, but the unease didn't leave. I stayed awake, listening for any more sounds, for anything that would give me a clue about what was going on. But it was quiet again, as if the world had gone still. The next morning, I found my car keys on the front step. No sign of anyone, no footprints in the dirt. It was as if the night had never happened. But I couldn't leave fast enough. I packed up everything and got in my car, started the engine, and drove off. As I passed the long stretch of road leading out of the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that someone had been watching me the entire time, and that whatever it was still out there, waiting. I don't know what happened out there, but I do know one thing. I've never gone back, and I don't plan to. There are places in this world that you just don't go. There are things in the woods that you don't want to find. And some things are better left undiscovered. It's 8 p.m. The sky outside has just begun to turn a deep shade of navy, and I can feel the cold settling into the cabin as I take in the peaceful isolation of the woods around me. It's a quiet place, nestled in the mountains, far from any towns or bustling streets. No one else for miles. Just me and the towering pines that seem to stretch endlessly into the sky. I came up here for some peace and solitude, to disconnect for a while, and that's exactly what I got. The small cabin was built years ago by an old man. Judging by the worn-out edges of the floorboards and the rusted nails that barely hold the rafters in place. It's not much, just a single room with a tiny wood stove, a bed in the corner, and a simple kitchen setup. But it's cozy in its own way, and I like the stillness. There's something comforting about the quiet, a serenity that feels hard to come by in the modern world. As I sit at the table, sipping on my coffee, I think back to how I ended up here. After a long few months of work and stress, I needed a break, a chance to breathe. I figured a few days in the cabin would be just what I needed to reset. I came up alone, wanting to clear my head and get away from everything. I grabbed my coat and headed outside to take a walk. The air was crisp, the ground covered in a thin blanket of snow that crunched under my boots. The trees stood tall around me, their branches creaking in the wind. The whole scene was picture perfect, like something out of a postcard. But there was something unsettling about it too. The woods were too quiet, almost unnervingly so. No chirping birds, no rustling animals, just the occasional gust of wind and the sound of my boots crunching through the snow. I walked for about an hour just exploring the area around the cabin. I couldn't help but notice the way the trees seemed to close in around me the farther I went. The path was narrow, barely wide enough for me to walk through without brushing up against the thick trunks. It was like the forest was watching, waiting for something. Eventually, I turned back, a slight unease settling in the pit of my stomach. It was nothing, I told myself, just the isolation. That's all it was. As I made my way back to the cabin, I noticed something strange. There were footprints in the snow leading up to the door. They weren't mine. I hadn't seen anyone else since I arrived, and the only way to get to the cabin was down a long, narrow path, far from any roads or trails. My heart rate picked up. I'm sure it's nothing, I told myself again. Maybe it's just an animal, maybe someone had walked up here before me. But the tracks were too big to be from any animal I knew. They were human, clear and distinct, and they led right up to my door. I froze in place, staring at the prints. I didn't know what to think. For a moment, I just stood there, watching the tracks as if they might suddenly vanish. But they didn't. They were still there, etched into the snow, leading right up to my doorstep. I walked inside, locking the door behind me. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself down. It's fine, I told myself. It's probably just someone passing by. The woods aren't as empty as they seem. But as the night settled in and the wind howled outside, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The silence was broken only by the occasional crackling of the wood stove, and the shadows of the trees outside swayed in the dim light. I tried to relax, pulling a blanket around my shoulders as I sat by the stove. The heat from the fire was comforting, but the unease lingered. Every so often, I'd glance toward the window, half expecting to see someone standing just outside, staring in. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept waking up, the sound of the wind outside and the creaking of the cabin making me jump. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those footprints in the snow, felt the weight of them pressing down on my chest. I couldn't get rid of the feeling that someone had been here, and they were still nearby, watching. The next morning, I woke up with a stiff neck, my eyes bleary from a restless night. The sun was just starting to rise, casting a faint golden glow over the snow outside. The cabin was still and quiet, the only sound the soft crackling of the fire. I decided to check outside again, just to see if the footprints were still there. Maybe I'd imagined it all. I opened the door and stepped out into the cold, the snow crunching underfoot. The tracks were still there, right where I had seen them the night before. But this time, something was different. There were more tracks. They didn't lead up to the cabin this time, though. They went off to the side, weaving through the trees. I could see them clearly, the prints sharp against the snow. They were fresh, as if whoever had made them had just passed by. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood there, staring at the trail. It was too late to turn back now, so I grabbed my jacket and began to follow the tracks, my breath visible in the cold air. The path wound deeper into the woods, and with each step, the feeling of unease grew stronger. The trees loomed overhead, casting long, dark shadows on the ground. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of my footsteps and the occasional crack of a twig beneath my boots. I don't know how long I walked. The tracks led me further and further away from the cabin, twisting through the dense forest. My mind raced with questions. Who had made these tracks? Why had they come up here? And why did they seem to be leading me somewhere? Eventually, the trail stopped at a small clearing. In the center of it stood a shack. It was old, the wood weathered and rotting. The door was ajar, and the windows were shattered, the glass long since fallen out. It looked abandoned, like something out of a nightmare. I stood there for a moment staring at the shack. The tracks led right up to it, but no one was around. No movement, no sounds, just the silence of the forest pressing in. I took a deep breath and stepped forward, my pulse quickening. My feet crunched in the snow as I walked closer to the shack. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and I immediately regretted it. The air inside was thick, stale, and musty. The smell of rot hit me hard, making me gag. It was dark inside, the light from outside barely filtering through the broken windows. I stepped inside, my eyes scanning the room. There was nothing here, just old furniture covered in dust and cobwebs. But then, my gaze fell on something that made my blood run cold. In the far corner, there was a pile of clothing, mostly torn and shredded. It looked like someone had been living here. My mind raced, and I could feel the panic rising in my chest. Someone had been here, and they were still out there. I needed to get back to the cabin. I turned to leave, but before I could, I heard a sound, a rustling coming from behind me. I spun around, my heart pounding in my throat. I couldn't see anyone, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I rushed to the door, my hands trembling as I pulled it open. The moment I stepped outside, I saw something move out of the corner of my eye, a figure standing in the trees just beyond the clearing. I froze, my blood running cold. The figure didn't move, just stood there, staring at me. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced, my body frozen in place. But something deep inside me told me I needed to leave. I turned and ran back toward the cabin, my feet slipping in the snow as I sprinted through the woods. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could hear the sound of footsteps behind me, getting closer. I didn't stop until I reached the cabin. I slammed the door shut and locked it behind me, my body shaking with adrenaline. I leaned against the door, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I stayed inside, the fire crackling in the stove, and didn't move from the cabin. I didn't hear anything else from outside, but I knew someone had been out there. Someone was watching me. The next day, I left. I couldn't stay another minute. I packed up my things, locked the cabin behind me, and drove away. I haven't been back since, and I don't think I ever will. The woods are quiet again, but I'll never forget the feeling of being watched, of knowing someone was out there, waiting. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I still feel it. That cold, eerie feeling that I'm not alone, that I never was. It was early October of 2017 when I decided to take some time off from everything. I was 32, living in St. Paul, Minnesota, working in property management, and I'd been getting chewed up by stress for months. Emails, phone calls, complaints. It felt like every hour of my day was claimed by someone else. I needed silence. I needed to hear myself think again. I hadn't slept right in weeks. When I finally burned through the last of my patience and sent a resignation email one Friday night, I packed a few things and got out the next morning. I remembered a small, off-grid cabin that my uncle had owned near Deadfall Ridge in northern Wisconsin. He'd passed away a few years earlier, and no one had touched the place since. I still had the key on an old ring. It wasn't far, maybe a 4-hour drive northeast. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I didn't want anyone knowing. I just needed to vanish for a while, away from lights, noise, everything. I loaded up my Subaru with a cooler, camping stove, canned food, extra water, a first aid kit, some books, and a sleeping bag. I took a small Ruger .22 rifle just for peace of mind, mostly for critters, I figured. The cell signal would be non-existent up there, so I downloaded some offline maps and a GPS backup. The plan was simple. Go up, spend a week in total silence, reset my brain, then come back to the world. The road narrowed the further I went. Asphalt turned to gravel, gravel turned to dirt, and eventually even that gave out. The trail was overgrown, but I remembered just enough to keep going. It was late afternoon when I finally pulled up beside the cabin. The place looked worse than I remembered. Moss was creeping up the sides, and one of the shutters was hanging half off. Still, the roof looked intact, and the door was still locked. Inside, it smelled like dust and dry wood. There were cobwebs in the corners and mouse droppings near the sink, but nothing too wild. The water pump was bone dry, which I expected, and the fireplace had old ash in it. I cracked a few windows and let the air settle. It took a few hours to clean the place up enough to feel livable, but by the time the sun dipped low, I had a small fire going, a can of chili heating on my little stove, and a cot set up in the corner with my sleeping bag. That first night was quiet, dead quiet, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I kept expecting to hear a plane or a car or even some distant dogs barking. But there was nothing, just the occasional wind dragging across the roof or the snap of a twig outside. By the third day, I'd settled into a rhythm. Wake up with the sun, boil some instant coffee, sit on the front steps and listen to the forest. Sometimes I read. Other times I'd just walk a trail for hours, following deer paths and old game trails through the woods. I didn't see anyone. No hunters, no hikers, no campers. Not even a hint of another soul. That suited me fine. On the fourth day, something changed. I woke up feeling stiff and cold. It had dipped below freezing overnight, and I hadn't stoked the fireplace before falling asleep. I pulled on a heavier hoodie and went to start a fire, but I noticed the woodpile looked different. Some of the pieces I'd stacked were moved, just slightly off. I thought maybe an animal had tried to dig around. A raccoon or porcupine, maybe. I brushed it off, got the fire going, and went about my morning. Later that afternoon, I went deeper into the woods than usual. I followed a dry creek I hadn't seen before, and it led to an old hunting blind about 2 miles out. It was just a platform nailed between two trees, rotted and leaning. I climbed up out of curiosity and found a rusted coffee can with old cigarette butts inside. I figured it hadn't been used in years. When I got back to the cabin around sunset, I found the front door cracked open. I froze. My heart kicked into overdrive. I was sure I'd locked it. I always did. My hand went straight to the rifle slung over my back. I didn't go inside right away. I stood in the clearing, listening. Nothing moved. The trees swayed a little in the wind, but there was no sound from the cabin. After a few minutes, I crept up, stepped to the side of the door, and nudged it open with the barrel of the rifle. Inside looked normal at first. Nothing obviously missing or trashed. But as I walked in slowly, I saw that the cooler had been opened. 2 cans were gone, one of chili and one of peaches. The bag with my matches was half dumped out. My sleeping bag had fresh dirt on it. I didn't know what to do. I checked around the cabin, but there was no one inside. I looked for tracks around the property, but the ground was hard and covered in dry leaves. Nothing clear. There was no forced entry, just an unlocked door. That night, I barely slept. I kept the rifle beside me, and every sound outside made me sit up and listen. At some point near 3 a.m., I heard what sounded like footsteps outside, slow, steady crunching in the leaves. I didn't move. I barely breathed. They passed the front porch, circled to the back, then faded. The next morning, I considered leaving, but I told myself maybe it was a drifter or an animal. Someone might have just stumbled onto the place, looking for food or shelter. That happens, right? Still, I packed everything up tight and carried the rifle with me all day, even inside. On day 5, I didn't go far from the cabin. I chopped more wood, boiled extra water, and stayed alert. Around noon, I found a cigarette but near the edge of the clearing. Still fresh, not even wet from the dew. I don't smoke. It hadn't been there before. That's when I knew someone was around. I made the choice to sleep during the day and stay up at night. That night, I sat in the dark with the fire out, wrapped in blankets, rifle in hand, and waited. Around 1:30 a.m., I saw movement near the tree line. Just a shape at first, then 2 people. They were crouched low, maybe 20 yards out, half hidden behind brush. They were watching the cabin. I felt paralyzed. I didn't know what they wanted, if they were armed, if they were just some crazy off-grid types, or worse. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I sat there in total darkness for hours, heart hammering, just watching back. At some point, they vanished. I didn't hear them go, just blinked and they were gone. The next morning, I walked to where they'd been. I found prints, deep ones, 2 people, maybe 3. One wore boots, another had lighter shoes, maybe sneakers. No gear, no trash, just tracks. I left that afternoon. I didn't pack carefully. I just shoved everything into the back of the Subaru, kept the rifle across my lap, and drove. I didn't stop until I hit a town with cell service. I called the county sheriff's office and gave them the coordinates. I didn't want to go back, even with police. They found signs of a camp not far from the cabin. Tarp lean-tos, burned cans, and a few stolen items. They told me it looked like transients. Probably 2 men and maybe a younger person. No names, no arrests. They'd already moved on. I went back to St. Paul. I didn't tell anyone much about it. I sold the cabin to a logger that winter for almost nothing. I've never gone back to the woods since. I still think about those nights, the way they watched from the trees, waiting, not saying anything, just watching. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't some haunted thing. It was real people, and somehow that's a whole lot worse. I had always wanted to spend time alone in a remote cabin. The idea of getting away from the constant noise of the city and the endless digital distractions seemed like a perfect break. When I found an old rental listing for a secluded cabin deep in the mountains, I booked it for a week without hesitation. The listing mentioned that the cabin was miles from the nearest town, with no cell service and only a small dirt road leading to it. That was exactly what I wanted, pure isolation. I arrived late in the afternoon. The drive up had been rough. The road was narrow and barely maintained, with potholes deep enough to rattle my truck. Thick trees lined both sides of the road, their branches arching over the path like they were closing in. When I finally saw the cabin, I felt a mix of relief and unease. It looked older than I expected, with weathered wood and a sagging porch. The place felt forgotten, like no one had been there in years. I parked the truck and stepped out, stretching my legs after the long drive. The air was crisp, the smell of damp earth and pine heavy around me. The only sounds were the wind through the trees and the distant rush of a river. It was eerily quiet. The cabin was small but functional. A single room with a fireplace, a kitchenette, and a cot in the corner. The furniture was old, the wooden floor scuffed from years of use. A thick layer of dust covered everything. I found a cabinet with some basic supplies, canned food, matches, and a few old tools. The generator behind the cabin was still in working order, giving me enough power for the lights and a small heater. As night fell, I made a fire in the fireplace and settled in with a book. The wind outside had picked up, howling through the trees. Occasionally, I heard something creak outside, but I told myself it was just the wind or some animal passing through. The first night was uneventful, though I woke up a few times to the sound of something moving outside. I told myself it was just the wind shifting the trees. The second day, I decided to explore the area around the cabin. There was a narrow trail leading further into the woods, so I followed it for a while. After about a mile, I found the remains of an old wooden structure, barely standing. It looked like another cabin, but much older, long abandoned. The roof had caved in, and most of the walls had collapsed. I stepped inside cautiously, The floor was covered in debris, rotting wood, broken furniture, and old, rusted tools. Something about the place felt off. There were deep scratches on the remaining walls, like something had clawed at them. I found old cans and a rusted-out stove, signs that someone had lived here long ago. But there were no signs of why they left. I felt a sudden urge to leave. I backed out of the structure and made my way quickly back to my cabin, glancing over my shoulder more than once. I told myself I was just being paranoid. That night, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. The wind had died down, but the silence was worse. It made every small noise stand out. The creak of the wooden beams, the occasional rustle outside. Then I heard something distinct. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. I held my breath, listening. They circled the cabin, pausing at the front porch. The old wooden planks creaked under the weight. I reached for the knife I had brought with me, gripping it tightly. The footsteps stopped. I waited, my heart pounding in my chest. Minutes passed. Nothing. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought I heard something outside. At first light, I stepped onto the porch. The ground was damp from the night air, and that's when I saw them, footprints in the mud. Not boot prints, bare feet. I scanned the tree line, but there was no sign of anyone. My gut told me to leave, but part of me wanted to believe it was just a hiker who had wandered too close. The third night, things escalated. I barricaded the door with a chair, just in case. Around midnight, I heard something again. This time, it wasn't just footsteps. I heard breathing, close, right outside the cabin. Then, a slow, deliberate knock on the door. I stayed completely still.
My knife was in my hand, my pulse hammering in my ears.
The knock came again. Then silence. I didn't move until the first light of dawn seeped through the windows. When I finally dared to check outside, the footprints were back. They led from the woods, stopped at my door, then disappeared back into the trees. I had seen enough. I packed my things and loaded them into the truck as fast as I could. As I was about to leave, I looked back at the cabin one last time. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The chair I had used to barricade the door, it was moved. Not knocked over, not pushed aside, moved neatly to the other side of the room. I didn't waste another second. I got in my truck and drove out of there, the tires skidding on the dirt road. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on the main road. I don't know who or what was out there, but I know one thing for sure. I will never stay in a remote cabin again.